International. I would like to welcome the readers and supporters of the World Socialist website who are participating in this international online rally to celebrate the launching or relaunch of the World Socialist website. I'm David North, the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the WSWS. The relaunch project, which spanned well over a year, involved intense technical, artistic, political, and theoretical work. It is now just over 3 weeks since the new version of the site went online on October 2nd, 2020. Since that date, there have been approximately 2,300,000 visits to the site and more than 3 million page views. The editorial board, of course, is gratified by the response to the relaunch site. But we recognize that the rapidly expanding readership of the WSWS does not justify self-satisfaction. The International Committee is compelled to examine this response critically. That is, to identify the objective processes that find expression in the significant growth in the daily circulation of the WSWS. The response to the World Socialist website reflects a process of mass political radicalization under conditions of the greatest crisis since the 1930s. The pandemic has exposed the social, economic, political, and moral bankruptcy of the world capitalist system. More than 1 million people have been killed by the COVID-19 virus. Within the United States alone, the death toll is approaching 250,000. By the end of the year, the number of Americans who will have died as a consequence of being infected will certainly be over 300,000. But even as the pandemic rages out of control throughout much of the world, the central preoccupation of capitalist governments is not the containment of the virus, but rather the protection of profits. This criminal priority underlies the adoption of the homicidal strategy of herd immunity, the toleration and even active encouragement of widespread infection, regardless of the toll on human life. The pandemic, as the World Socialist website has explained since the beginning of the outbreak, is a trigger event, which, like the outbreak of World War I, has vastly intensified and brought to the point of explosion all the contradictions of the capitalist system. The two great classes in society, the capitalist class and the working class, are driven into ever more direct and brutal conflict as each of these two forces seeks to resolve the contradictions in its own interests. The methods and policies through which the capitalist elites strive to overcome the crisis are the suppression of democracy, fascism, and war, all of which are directed to the massive exploitation, atomization, and impoverishment of the masses of the working people. In response, the working class is compelled to enter onto the road of revolutionary struggle. This is the historical and political context within which the relaunch of the World Socialist website has taken place. But to recognize the objective historical process of which the development of the WSWS is an expression does not mean that the relaunch of the World Socialist website, let alone the initial founding of the site nearly 23 years ago, has been the automatic outcome of blind historical forces. Rather, the World Socialist website is the product of the conscious effort of the cadre of the International Committee of the Fourth International to resolve the crisis of revolutionary leadership. The WSWS was first launched in February 1998. Only 6 years had passed since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. For the countless varieties of anti-Marxist revisionism and petty bourgeois leftism, the breakdown of the bureaucratic regime, as well as the impotence of labor and trade union bureaucracies throughout the world, was met with a paroxysm of despair. Midnight in the century, they claim, had arrived. The political and historical situation was appraised in an entirely different manner by the International Committee, which was neither surprised nor in the least discouraged by the fulfillment of Trotsky's prediction that of the old and reactionary organizations, not one stone would be left upon another. Notwithstanding the collapse of Stalinism and the putrefaction of the old national and reformist and trade union organizations, the capitalist system remained beset by its insoluble contradictions. The task confronting the Fourth International was to prepare for the next stage in the crisis of capitalism and the renewal of the revolutionary movement of the working class. This historically grounded perspective did not underestimate the enormous difficulties that would have to be overcome. The Trotskyist movement understood and did not minimize the immense damage that had been done to the political consciousness and self-confidence of the international working class by decades of crimes and betrayals committed by Stalinism, Maoism, social democracy, and the pro-corporatist trade unions. Moreover, it was an undeniable fact that these crimes and betrayals had profoundly undermined and even discredited the idea of socialism among broad sections of the working class. It would take, we understood, the pressure of objective events and the emergence of a new generation for the wounds of the past to be healed. But in this process, the International Committee recognized its own critical role. In 1993, during my first meeting in Kiev with the great Soviet Russian historian Vadim Rogovin, who was then working on the first volume of his history of the struggle of the left opposition led by Trotsky against the Stalinist bureaucracy, he asked me how the renewal of a socialist movement could be achieved. I stated that the International Committee was determined to connect the fight for the program of Trotskyism with the rebuilding of a genuine socialist world outlook and culture within the working class. That is a very lofty ambition, Vadim replied. And he demonstrated his support for this perspective by completing 7 volumes of his great historical work, Was There an Alternative? And Vadim, who dedicated his final volume to the International Committee, lived to see the relaunching of the World Socialist website before he died of cancer in the autumn of 1998. Since the relaunching of the site, there have been more than 8,000 daily editions of the WSWS. It was initially posted 5 days a week and moved fairly rapidly to posting 6 days a week. Not a single scheduled posting date has been missed. Such tenacity is only possible when a publication is guided by a perspective rooted in Marxist theory and the conscious assimilation of the Fourth International's vast historical experience of revolutionary struggle. In July 1998, less than a half year after the launching of the WSWS, the political and intellectual foundations and motivations of its work were defined as follows. First, the insistence of the ICFI on the primacy of internationalism as the basis of political strategy and tactical organization of the working class. Second, the uncompromising character of the struggle waged by the International Committee against the domination of the working class by the reactionary labor bureaucracies. Third, the emphasis placed upon the revival of a genuine socialist political culture within the working class as an essential intellectual and, one might add, spiritual premise of a new revolutionary international movement. Fourth, the struggle against spontaneism and political fatalism in relation to the development of the crisis of capitalism, the class struggle, and the socialist revolution. The endurance and growth of the World Socialist website testifies to the correctness of these foundational principles and the Marxist materialist world outlook and Trotskyist political program on which they are based. But even the most advanced scientific theory and revolutionary program cannot be actualized unless it is fought for. The Marxist program and the high level of political consciousness required for the emergence of a mass socialist movement cannot be developed spontaneously within the working class. The development of a revolutionary working class movement, deeply influenced by a socialist world outlook and culture, requires the unrelenting and persistent activity of the Marxist cadre. After nearly 23 years of continuous and uninterrupted publication of the WSWS, the work of the cadre of the International Committee can justly be described as persistent and unrelenting. The publication of the World Socialist website has required, during these more than 2 decades of publication, the daily collaboration of cadre living on different continents. The staff of the WSWS consists of cadre of a wide range of political experience. Some of the regular writers of the website were comrades such as Barry Gray, Patrick Martin, Nick Beams, Vijay Diaz, Chris Marsden, Peter Schwartz, Ulrich Rippert, David Walsh, Larry Porter, and Fred Bezelis have been engaged in revolutionary work for many decades, even a half century and longer, and we still have a fight left in us. Many more writers, and their numbers are rapidly growing, are new recruits to the sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International. And there are comrades now contributing regularly to the WSWS who are working hard to establish new sections of the International Committee in the countries and regions in which they are located. And some of them will be speaking today. A website, though, does not live by writers alone. The WSWS is sustained by an international cadre that attends to the technical maintenance of the site, who proofread articles, and then who post them on the website. It is hard work. And under conditions in which the World Socialist website must wage a daily battle against the corporate censors, party cadre all over the world intervene in innumerable social media platforms to bring the postings of the WSWS to the attention of a global audience. And this work is strengthened immeasurably by the efforts of our countless devoted readers and supporters, and we thank them heartily. Of course, the publication of the WSWS could not be sustained without the financial resources provided by its devoted readers and supporters. Terence, a great playwright of the ancient world, wrote, "I am human, and I think nothing human is alien to me. This universal outlook is expressed in the content of the WSWS. The range of its coverage of subjects, events, and experience is vast. The World Socialist website is oriented first and foremost to the working class. As long as the working class remains under the domination of capitalism, the central focus of the WSWS must be on providing the working class with detailed coverage and analysis of political events and social struggles. It must teach workers to recognize the difference between a genuine revolutionary program and the counterfeit program produced by the political agents of the ruling class. The WSWS must continuously raise the historical consciousness of the working class, which is essential for a correct orientation and response to contemporary events. Trotskyist movement does not tolerate the falsification and denigration of the historical conquests of the past, paid in blood, whether those of the Socialist October Revolution in Russia or of the 2 great bourgeois democratic revolutions fought on the battlefields of the young American Republic. We defend them all. To the greatest extent possible, the WSWS strives to raise the scientific knowledge and cultural awareness of the working class. There is no aspect of culture that falls outside the purview of the working class. Class consciousness is enriched and made more acute by intellectual engagement and empathy with the widest range of human experience. The aim of the WSWS is to raise the consciousness of the international working class to the level required for its unification and the global coordination of its struggles to carry out the World Socialist Revolution and achieve the liberation of humanity, of all ethnicities, nationalities, religion, and racial backgrounds, from all forms of oppression. Today, we shall hear from speakers who have played a critical role in the work of the World Socialist website. The list of speakers is necessarily limited by time. Therefore, they are speaking as representatives of a vast collective effort. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. And that will be Comrade Vijay Dias. He is the General Secretary of the Sri Lankan section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. Comrade Vijay's political work spans well over a half century. He first became active in revolutionary politics in what was then Ceylon in the early 1960s, in the youth movement of the Lanka Sama Samaja Party. And he soon came into opposition with the opportunist politics of its leadership, which led to the entry of the LSSP into the bourgeois coalition government, what we came to know as the Great Betrayal, a betrayal which was to exact a terrible toll on the working class in Sri Lanka and indeed throughout Asia. Comrade Vijay was a founding member of the new Sri Lankan section of the International Committee, established in 1968. And in 1987, following the tragic death of the first General Secretary of what was then called the Revolutionary Communist League, Comrade Vijay assumed that position. And he has held that for the past 33 years under the most difficult conditions. Sri Lanka has passed through a dreadful civil war that was the product of the communalist politics of all the bourgeois parties and nationalist parties. It must be said that Comrade Vijay and his comrades in the SEP in Sri Lanka represent the only party that speaks with authority among all communities in Sri Lanka. Comrade Vijay is beloved in the Sinhala community among the workers of the Sinhala workers, as well as among the Tamil workers. And I am very, very proud to welcome Comrade Vijay today to speak to this rally. Comrade Vijay.
Comrades, the relaunch of the World Socialist website is a tremendous step forward taken by the International Committee of the Fourth International in building the World Party of Socialist Revolution. Emphasizing the historic significance of the WSWS, the chairman of the International Editorial Board, Comrade David North, made the following point in the statement issued to welcome the relaunch. He said, I quote, "The new technology made possible a far better alignment of the daily practice of the International Committee with its international strategy and program. With the founding of the World Socialist website, the International Committee of the Fourth International could respond to daily events wherever they occurred with single political voice as the World Party of Socialist Revolution. The conditions of COVID-19 pandemic has glaringly revealed all the historic problems bound up with the unstoppable decay of world capitalism, which today threatens world humanity with nothing less than a return to barbarism through a nuclear war. At the same time, this has intensified the class struggles of the working class and the oppressed masses, raising the burning need of the socialist revolution on a global scale. Only the theory of permanent revolution, advocated by Trotsky, provides the guidance to the world working class to lead the oppressed masses, irrespective of their language or nationality, to come out of the social catastrophe created under capitalism. The relaunched WSWS readily presents ICFI's analysis of the world events to the readers in a more attractive and more powerful way. What inspires those who come in contact with WSWS is not just the layout of the front page that covers the current world developments, but its depth and direction to the wealth of essential historical Marxist information it communicates through archival material. Pandemic left no room for any doubt that the region where we live, South Asia, as many other regions in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, cannot find solutions even to their basic social problems as health without the aid of the resources of the advanced country. This is the historical legacy of all such regions which were subjugated to imperialist exploitation for many centuries. The masses of these countries are confronted more than anywhere else in the globe with the burning need to participate in the world socialist revolution. Relaunch WSWS facilitates the theoretical and political training of a collective leadership for this revolution, making them aware of the need for close collaboration in this task, not only on a daily basis, but even on an hourly basis, as the postings are now done on the site around the clock. Such preparations of the cadres of the World Party is unavoidable in countering the imperialist strategy of social counter-revolution and world war led under US imperialism. While South Asian capitalist governments in particular are made pawns in the strategic designs of US aggression against China, all of these regimes within their own countries are implementing rapid dictatorial measures to brutally deal with any political dissent. All factions of alternative bourgeois parties and their Stalinist and pseudo-left hangers-on stand vehemently against mobilizing the masses to counter these measures. Following the footsteps of fascistic rule of Donald Trump, hasty constitutional changes are adopted in bourgeois parliaments of every country in the region, including India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, to give legal cover for their militaristic policies. This clears the ground for the working class to assume the leadership of the rural poor of all communities in the struggle to achieve the belated democratic task and lead them on the path of socialist transformation. ICF has already proved through the work of WSWS during the past 22 years that its ability is unquestionable in providing the perspective and leadership needed to achieve a victory of the world working class in this historic struggle. The relaunched world organ will facilitate ICFI and its sections to be established as mass socialist revolutionary parties in every country in the coming period. We, as members of the SCP, Sri Lanka, rededicate ourselves to build the revolutionary parties in the Indian subcontinent and South Asia as part of the development of the ICFI as the World Party of Socialist Revolution. Thank you, Comrade.
Thank you very much, Comrade Vijay. Our next speaker will be Comrade Cheryl Crisp, the National Secretary of the Australian section of the International Committee, the Socialist Equality Party. Comrade Cheryl is a founding member of the Australian section and has led the SEP as National Secretary for the past 2 years. Australia is often referred to as the lucky continent in the bourgeois media, but it is nothing of the sort. It is no more exempt from the problems of social inequality that are rampant throughout the capitalist world than any other advanced capitalist country. And it is to this question that Comrade Cheryl will address herself in her remarks today. Comrade Cheryl.
Thanks, Comrade Dave. The relaunch of the World Socialist website on October the 2nd this year marks a milestone in the history of the International Committee of the Fourth International in its fight for the construction of a revolutionary leadership in the working class. The fact that it has been launched in the midst of the greatest crisis confronting capitalism since World War II is lawful. More than 150 years ago, Marx, writing in Volume 1 of Capital, explained the relationship between the classes. And he said, accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. He was describing not a policy of governments or business leaders, but the result of capitalist accumulation itself. In other words, the social gulf between the wealthy capitalist elite and the working class is inherent in the very processes of production. This has not changed today. Since the World Socialist website was launched in 1998, it has concentrated exceptional attention and focus on inequality and the increasing polarisation of wealth between the ruling class and the working class. This is what now characterises life in the 21st century. The WSWS is a voice through which workers, young people and the poor can speak, and it is the working class to whom we are turned. The WSWS explains not just what is happening, but more importantly, why. It alone has characterised the pandemic as a trigger event, which has accelerated the already underlying contradictions and crises of capitalism. COVID-19, a virus predictable, predicted, and willfully ignored by capitalist governments, has disproportionately afflicted the working class and the poor. Workers and the poor cannot social distance. Many of those working cannot do so from home, but are compelled to toil in unsafe factories and workplaces. Many have underlying health conditions and are less able to afford health care. The murderous and criminal clamour to lift restrictions and oppose lockdowns has doomed hundreds of thousands to infection and death. But still Wall Street and the markets rise, and that is the only concern for the ruling class. In January 2020, prior to the pandemic, the richest 2,153 people on the planet had more wealth than the bottom 4.6 billion people. This polarisation has only widened. The pandemic has been used as the occasion for the further transfer of trillions of dollars of wealth through bailout packages from the poor to the rich. The turn by the ruling class and the capitalist state, most starkly expressed with Trump, to fascistic measures only highlights the impossibility of peacefully maintaining a social system characterised by the vast chasm of inequality. The virus knows no borders, and neither do the conditions imposed by capitalism. The working class is an international class, and increasingly the lives of American, British, European and Australian workers are becoming indistinguishable from their class brothers and sisters in Africa, Asia and South America. The revolts against the worsening social conditions span countries and continents and are primarily directed against inequality. Some of the most widely read articles on the WSWS are those which chronicle the experiences of workers and their struggles at work and the fight against inequality. This perspective of the WSWS stands in stark contrast to that of the pseudo-lefts who ignore the conditions and experiences of the broad mass of people. In the interests of a privileged middle-class layer, they promote identity politics of race, gender and sexuality, deny that the major division in society is class, and reject the revolutionary role of the working class. The developing and growing revolutionary struggles, however, need more than just courage and determination. They require a political perspective, a socialist program, and a revolutionary party to lead them in the task for the overthrow of the capitalist system. It is for that purpose that the ICFI and the World Socialist website was launched, and that the transformation that we are so proud tonight to mark has been developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Cheryl. Our next speaker will be Comrade David Walsh. So many thousands of our readers all over the world read with delight the writings of Comrade Dave, which encompass a vast range of cultural material, including cinema reviews, book reviews, developments in the arts in general, literature, and a wide range of social questions. But underlying all of this wonderful writing, some of which is contained in the volume, The Sky Between the Leaves, is a vast political experience in the Trotskyist movement, which also spans, I believe, more than a half century. David's work is very rare nowadays because it is engaged in a continuous struggle against all sorts of fashionable theories of irrationalism, which serve only to disorient the masses, not to enlighten them. The arts coverage, cultural coverage, which is contained in the World Socialist website and which is constantly developing a broadening cadre of comrades familiar with these questions and who can contribute seriously to the education of the movement, is one of Comrade Dave's great achievements. And I'm very, very proud and to welcome him to speak at this rally. Comrade Dave.
Thank you. The relaunch of the World Socialist website is an enormous achievement, which gives us the means of widening the influence of Marxist ideas in the international working class. The fundamental aim of the WSWS, as our recent statement welcoming the relaunch argues, is to provide the working class with the theoretical understanding, historical knowledge, and political insight necessary to wage a highly conscious struggle against capitalism. We view and have always viewed our work on art, science, and culture generally in the same light. We strive at every point to raise the cultural level of the working class in alignment with its immense historical responsibilities to create a socialist society based on equality and solidarity. All this takes on a more intense and urgent character at the present moment, dominated by worldwide political and socioeconomic breakdown and a developing revolutionary crisis. Over the course of nearly 23 years, we have posted thousands of reviews and comments on artistic works in various forms and media on the WSWS. It has been an indispensable element of the website. No other so-called left-wing political tendency has even made a serious effort in this regard. They accept the dominance of academic and postmodernist interpretations with all their skepticism and pessimism, their rejection of the effort to cognize the world, their hostility to socialism and the working class. Necessarily, the Marxist critic is always responding to a particular film or book, exhibition or play as it comes to the screen or lands on his or her desk. To a certain extent, he or she is taken in one direction or another, aesthetically, socially, or historically by a given work. This one may lead the critic, for example, to 19th century France. The next raises questions about Soviet art in the 1920s. A third obliges him or her to consider once again the consequences of the Hollywood blacklist. But whatever the challenge bound up with a particular work, we're always operating with certain underlying conceptions that give shape and coherence to what we do. And those conceptions come out of the long history of the Marxist movement, including the work of figures like Georgy Plekhanov and Alexander Vronsky, Of course, in particular, Trotsky's struggle against Stalinism, and the protracted fight of the International Committee of the Fourth International against national opportunism and for a renaissance of classical Marxism. We begin from the premise that the working class must consciously intervene and change the course of history. This is not something that can be done behind its back. Every ounce of our energy must be exerted to assist workers in deepening their knowledge of society, history, human behavior, psychology. The success of the socialist project depends on a far higher level of knowledge and thinking within far wider sections of the population than currently holds sway. The artistic cognition of the world is essential in this process. Art, Trotsky insisted, has made human beings more complex and flexible, generalizing their experience and widening their horizons, raising their psyche to a higher level and enriching their minds in a multitude of ways. This has been the conception of the socialist movement from its earliest days. How does a revolution come about? In the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, our movement spent a good deal of time considering this. We determined that the 1917 Russian Revolution was the product of a decades-long effort to build up an international socialist culture. Stalinism had delivered immense physical, moral, and intellectual blows to that culture. We dedicated ourselves to rebuilding it. In 1998, not coincidentally, only a few weeks before the launch of the WSWS, at a school we held in Australia, in a discussion on art, we addressed what it was that would create an environment, quote, in which it becomes suddenly possible for large numbers of people to rise up and consciously set about the dismantling of the old society, casting aside the prejudices, habits, and learned behavior built up over decades, even centuries. We suggested that the sharpening of the critical faculties of the population and the raising of its spiritual level to the point where large numbers of people will demonstrate nobility, make great sacrifices, think only of their fellow men and women, all of this arises out of an intellectual and moral heightening, which must be the product of the advance of human culture as a whole. These ideas were cemented into, as it were, the foundations of the World Socialist website, which, as I say, was launched only 2 weeks later. As Rosa Luxemburg wrote in a letter in 1916, socialism is not a bread and butter problem, but a cultural movement, a great and proud world ideology. We have made significant strides in the nearly 23 years of the WSWS. No one has a record like ours in regard to criticism of and opposition to the existing political and cultural state of affairs. That extends, of course, to our rejection of identity politics, our exposure of the Me Too sexual witch hunt, and our devastating critique of the 1619 Project. The present situation is immensely challenging and complex. In the cultural field, as in others, the pandemic has acted like an accelerant, speeding up processes already underway. The figures are staggering. We reported on some of them the other day. One recent study suggests that in the US, the COVID-19 pandemic has wiped out, quote, as many as half of all jobs for performing artists and musicians, and nearly a third of jobs for all those who work in the creative economy, end of quote. Another survey indicates that 95% of American artists report a loss of income. 62% report a, quote, drastic decrease in work that generates income. This is a worldwide phenomenon. A report from South Africa, for example, states that this year, quote, when COVID-19 spread quicker than wildfire, artists and cultural workers found themselves destitute, stranded, and rejected by the very government that claimed to support them, end of quote. The fundamental attitude of the ruling elite everywhere toward culture, unless it's conventional, harmless, and money-making, is a hostile one. It fears every word and thought today that doesn't confirm the sanctity of property and wealth. The powers that be welcome the destruction of independent-minded and more radical artistic organizations. The defunding of the arts has gone on for decades, and now the brutal policies of the various governments, which are allowing the coronavirus to ravage the population, is threatening wide portions of the artistic community. We anticipate a global radicalization in the working class and among artists along with every other thinking segment of society, not simply because of the economic disaster affecting the latter specifically, but because of the general catastrophe represented by the capitalist order, the endless wars, the destitution of tens of millions, the growth of far-right and fascistic forces. The discrediting of the present system is ongoing and irreversible, and this will deeply influence the further development of all the arts. The naked drive for profit, which takes on an openly murderous character in the present situation, will provoke renewed horror and disgust. The new design of the WSWS allows us to bring forward more of what we have written and what the Fourth International has stood for, helping to educate a new generation thirsty for knowledge. We made a pledge to our readers in 1998 that we would cover artistic and cultural developments to the full extent of our abilities and means. We rededicate ourselves to that effort now, with full confidence that the WSWS will provide the intellectual and political resources for the coming global revolutionary struggles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Dave. Our next speaker is a representative of a younger generation of writers and activists and leaders in the International Committee of the Fourth International. Comrade Oscar Grenville is a member of the Australian section of the Socialist of the International Committee, and he has been very active in following and writing on the critical case of Julian Assange, a journalist who has been persecuted relentlessly by the United States, Britain, who has been denied even the elementary defense of his democratic rights that is owed to him as a citizen of Australia. And the World Socialist website has played, I think, an important role in the critical struggle for his defense, vindication, and ultimate liberation. Comrade Oscar has written a great deal on this subject, and I would like to welcome Oscar and ask that he address this very, very critical issue at this rally. Comrade Oscar.
Thank you. The relaunch of the WSWS is a major advance in the struggle to unify the working class internationally. This site will politically educate workers and young people around the world and mobilize them in the fight to end capitalism amid its deepest crisis since the 1930s. The ruling elites are responding to growing working class opposition with the blunt instruments of repression. The past year has witnessed brutal attacks on rallies against police violence internationally, snatch squads grabbing demonstrators off the streets of Portland and other American cities, a bloody crackdown on protesters in Nigeria, and a turn to authoritarianism from India to Brazil and the United States. In this situation, the WSWS plays the decisive role in the fight against state attacks, frame-ups, and in the struggle to free political prisoners. The World Socialist website is the tribune of the people, described by the great Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin some 100 years ago. It responds, to use Lenin's words, to any and every manifestation of police tyranny and autocratic outrage. It spearheads the defense of journalists, publishers, political dissidents, and workers who come under state attack. This is what the WSWS has done in the fight to free WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. For the past decade, we've refuted all of the lies peddled by the intelligence agencies, the corporate media, and the pseudo-left to undermine popular support for Assange. He sits in a London jail cell as we meet now and faces life in a US supermax prison. His only offence was exposing the war crimes, the coups, and the sordid intrigues of the major imperialist powers. The defence of Assange and courageous whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden depends on the mobilisation of the working class. The fight for democratic rights can only go forward in a struggle against capitalism and the ruling class plans for dictatorship. The attempt to prosecute Assange is not only an assault on press freedom, Its purpose is to intimidate the emerging movement of the working class and create a precedent for far broader victimizations. These dangers have already been revealed in the plight of 13 workers' leaders from the Maruti Suzuki car plant in Manesar, India. They've been imprisoned in tortuous conditions since 2012. The workers had led a fight against the poverty wages, sweatshop conditions, and precarious contracts in the Indian auto industry. They were then framed by the company, the state and national governments, and the courts for a fire at the facility in 2012. Initially facing the death sentence, they now confront spending the rest of their lives in prison for the crime of fighting for the interests of the working class. Despite the different circumstances, there are clear parallels between the case of Julian Assange and the Maruti Suzuki workers. Both have been subjected to a torrent of lies and slanders by the authorities and the corporate press. Both have been abandoned by the trade unions, the official political parties, and the pseudo-left. And it's the WSWS that has taken the lead in the fight to free Assange and the Maruti Suzuki workers as part of our struggle to mobilise the working class. The relaunch of the WSWS creates the conditions for these struggles to be expanded. The relaunch site brings forward the entire heritage of the socialist movement, including its great struggles in defence of political prisoners. This includes the Dreyfus case in France at the turn of the 20th century, the fight against the frame-up of Sacco and Vanzetti in 1920s America, and the struggle to defend our Sri Lankan comrades against attacks by the military and the government. We call on everyone watching today to join us in this fight for democratic rights and for socialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Oscar. Our next speaker will be Professor Joseph Scalise, who is teaching history at Nanyang University in Singapore. I think it can be said without exaggeration that he is the world's foremost authority on the history, tragic and bloody history, of Stalinism, Maoism in the Philippines. And his work has attracted international respect and, of course, the fear of those who still uphold the politics of Stalinism and Maoism, even after its long and terrible legacy of betrayal. This is a challenging time for historians. There are those who do carry out honest and principled and courageous scholarship. And certainly Professor Scalise is foremost among them. So I would like, with great pride, to welcome Joe Scalise to address this rally. Joe, go ahead.
Thank you, David. I am pleased to be able to join with the other speakers in this rally in celebrating the relaunch of the World Socialist website. As David mentioned, I am a historian studying the political history of the 20th century in Southeast Asia, and particularly the Philippines. My scholarship documented the way in which the Communist Party of the Philippines, the CPP, and its leader, Jose Maria Sison, in their quest to form alliances with the ruling elite, used the program of Stalinism to repeatedly betray the interests of the working class. The most recent and egregious example of this was the alliance formed by the CPP with the fascistic Rodrigo Duterte in 2016, as he took office as president. Sison responded to my scholarship by lying about his own history and that of the party, and by embarking on a series of threats and slanders against me. The WSWS mounted a remarkable campaign in defense of me and of my scholarship against Sison's lies and threats. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude. My scholarship owes a far greater debt than this to the WSWS and to the history of the Trotskyist movement that it represents. While I spent a decade in the archives and newspaper rooms collecting the facts of the CPP's political betrayals, my ability to understand their inner logic, to grasp the essence of Stalinism, rested entirely upon the political insights, contained in the writings of Leon Trotsky and of the Trotskyist movement, contained today on the World Socialist website and the International Committee of the Fourth International. The World Socialist website places extraordinary value on the careful study of history. The working class around the globe has been denied access to its own history. One of the functions of a revolutionary party is to serve as the organ of the working class for the preservation and careful study of this history. The WSWS has consciously set itself this goal. I have followed with much interest, for example, the WSWS defense of the progressive character of the American Revolution against the racialist falsifications of the 1619 Project. I believe that I speak for what is a growing awareness in the academic community, or some of its sections, that the historical work of the World Socialist website is of the highest scholarly caliber. The unrivaled historical material produced by the World Socialist website is an expression of the fact that the defense of historical truth has always been a paramount concern of the Trotskyist movement, an expression of its life and death struggle against the lies and betrayals of Stalinism over the course of a century. In service to their own privileged interests, the Stalinist bureaucracies in first Moscow and then Beijing put forward a program of nationalism and class collaboration, which they attempted to dress up as Marxism. The results of this program were incalculably catastrophic. The Stalinists allied workers around the world with their capitalist enemies. They divided the working class and facilitated the rise of fascism. They formed alliances with the imperialist powers and subordinated the colonized peoples to their colonial masters. And they systematically murdered the conscious Marxist opposition to these betrayals, the Trotskyist movement. The Stalinists covered over every one of these crimes with a mountain of lies. History, however, as Hegel stated, is a truly terrifying judge. Stalinism stands before the bar of history, utterly exposed, as a nationalist, anti-Marxist betrayal of the working class. The recent support given by the CPP to Duterte is but another betrayal within this long history. As Stalinism has been exposed, the perspective of Leon Trotsky and the Trotskyist movement has been completely vindicated. In opposition to the nationalism and class collaboration of Stalinism, the Trotskyist movement defended the heritage of Marxism and the need for the independence of the working class in the international struggle for socialism. That perspective today is defended and advanced by the World Socialist website. The workers and oppressed masses of the Philippines, throughout Asia and around the world, have cause to celebrate in the relaunch of the World Socialist website, for this is their voice, and it articulates their objective interests. The WSWS stands without rival in modern political history for its scientific precision, historical depth, political foresight, humane cultural sensitivity, and unswerving commitment to its political principles. These have, I believe, made the WSWS the voice of the international working class. I'm going to repeat a portion of my remarks in Tagalog. Taos-pusong pagbati sa lahat ng mga nakikinig sa rally na ito na nagdidiriwang na muling pagpaglunsad ng World Socialist website. Isa akong historiador na nag-aaral ng kasaysayang politikal ng ika-20 siglo ng Timog Silangang Asya na nakafocus sa Pilipinas. Naitala sa aking pagsaliksik kung paano ang Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas o CPP at ang pinuno nito na si Jose Maria Sison sa kanilang hangarin na bumuo ng isang alyansa sa naghaharing uri ay gumamit ng programa ng Stalinismo upang paulit-ulit na ipagkanulo ang interes ng uring manggagawa. Ang pinakahuli at napakatindi na halimbawa nito ay ang alyansa ng CPP kay Rodrigo Duterte, isang pasista, noong 2016 nang siya'y umupo bilang Pangulo. Tumugon si Sison sa aking pagsaliksik sa pamamagitan ng pagsisinungaling tungkol sa kanyang sariling kasaysayan at sa kasaysayan ng partido na kanyang pinamumunuan. Gumamit siya ng mga banta at paninirang puri labang sa akin. Ang WSWS ay naglunsad ng isang kampanya ng pagtanggol sa akin laban sa mga banta at kasinungalingan ni Sison at ako'y nagpapasalamat sa kanila. Ang utang ko sa WSWS ay hindi lamang sa kanilang pagtanggol sa akin, Nagtrabaho ako ng isang dekada sa mga arkibo at aklatan sa pagkolekta ng mga detalye ng pagkakanulo ng CPP. Ngunit nakayahan ko lang maunawaan ang panloob na lohiko nito at ang Stalinismo at kung ano ito dahil sa mga sinulat ni Leon Trotsky at ng kilusang Trotskyista. Ang pananaw na ito ay ngayon pinapatuloy ng World Socialist website. Ang kasaysayan, gaya ng sinabi ni Hegel, ay isang katakot-takot na hukom. Ang Stalinismo ay ganap na lalantad bilang isang nasyonalistang kontra-Marxista na pagtaksil sa uri ng manggagawa. Ang pananaw naman ni Leon Trotsky at ng kilusang Trotskyista ay ganap na nabigyang katwiran. Ang pananaw na ito ay pinagtatanggol at isinusulong ngayon ng World Socialist website. Ang mga manggagawa ng Pilipinas sa buong Asya at sa buong mundo ay may dahilan upang ipagdiriwang sa muling paglunsad ng World Socialist website sapagkat ito ang kanilang tinig. Salamat.
Thank you very much, Joe, for those remarks. Our next speaker will be Comrade Nick Beams. The foundation of Marxism is, of course, as a science, finds its most complex expression in the analysis of the capitalist mode of production. It was in Marx's Capital that the theory of historical materialism was substantiated. And of course, the analysis of the World Socialist website and our examination of political events is always in the final analysis based on our examination of these objective contradictions, not in a mechanical manner, not in a manner which ignores the complexities through which what Marx referred to as the impulse at the base of the productive process of society finds its complex ideological, political, cultural expressions. But that fundamental reality and the understanding of these contradictions is essential to the development of a politics which expresses objective necessity. And in the work of the International Committee on Questions of Political Economy, on the analysis of the contradictions of capitalism, of course, it is Comrade Nick Beams who has played the leading role for many, many years. He is a founding member of the Australian section of the International Committee when it was first the Socialist Labour League. In 1985, he played a leading role in the struggle against the betrayal of the Workers' Revolutionary Party and was a critical force in the renewal of the International Committee. And over many, many years, he has developed the analysis of the International Committee in writings which are followed by thousands and thousands of readers all over the world, and which has been critical to the education of our cadre. He also served for some 30 years as the National Secretary of the Socialist Labour League, and then as the Socialist Equality Party. So I'd like to welcome Comrade Nick to address today's rally. Comrade Nick.
Thank you. The relaunch of the World Socialist website is truly an historic achievement of the World Trotskyist movement and the international working class. I have been privileged to have been involved from the very initiation of the WSWS in writing on issues of political economy. And so I would like to direct your attention to some of the fundamental principles that have guided our work in this area over the past 22 years, and which will continue to do so in the tumultuous future now unfolding. Let me begin by pointing out that our coverage is not about so-called economics as such, but political economy. We seek, of course, to analyze the day-to-day twists and turns of the capitalist economy, getting to grips with a complex array of data, statistics, and so on, from the latest figures on GDP to the gyrations in financial markets. But we do so from the standpoint that these numbers, these things, are the expression in the final analysis of social forces and class relations. That is, we approach the myriad questions that arise from an analysis of what is called the economy on the basis of the historical materialist method elaborated by Karl Marx. He explained that the objective basis of socialist revolution is the development of the contradiction between the productive forces, the economic base, and the social relations of production in which they are encased. Relations based on the private ownership of the means of production and the market. And these social relations, contrary to all the ideological outpourings of the bourgeoisie and its agencies, are not eternal, God-given, or arise from nature. They are an historical phase in the ongoing development of human society and are destined to be overthrown by the working class. Our standpoint is therefore partisan. It is based on the interests of the class that objectively stands opposed to capitalist economy. Now, in saying that, we immediately encounter the retort from the ideological representatives of the bourgeoisie that our analysis is not and cannot be scientific. Quite the contrary is the case. It is only by striving to articulate the historic interests of the working class when examining every so-called economic question that an objective, that is scientific analysis, can be developed. Now, that's not mere assertion on my part. It can be established by contrasting the record of the WSWS over the past 22 years, grounded on all the antecedent analysis by the International Committee of the Fourth International, with that of the bourgeoisie and all its think tanks and institutions. When the WSWS was launched in February 1998, the world capitalist economy was passing through the effects of the so-called Asian financial crisis that had erupted in July 1997. According to US President Bill Clinton, reflecting the orgy of free market celebration occasioned by the liquidation of the Soviet Union by the Stalinist bureaucracy in 1991, this was a mere blip on the road to capitalist globalization and the enhancement of the so-called unipolar moment of US domination. Flowing from our scientifically grounded partisanship, we advanced a completely opposed position. This was not an Asian crisis, but rather the expression, initially in Asia, of a deepening crisis of the global capitalist system. A historic crisis produced by the acceleration of financial parasitism, itself an expression of the growing decay and rot at the very heart of the profit system. The so-called Asian crisis was followed by the collapse of the US hedge fund long-term capital management in 1998, a preview of what was to come 10 years later, then the tech bubble and its bursting in 2000, 2001, and then the global financial crisis of 2008. Despite, or one should say because of the crisis, the orgy of speculation continued as the Fed and other central banks pumped trillions of dollars into the financial system. The wise heads of the ruling classes told us these were temporary measures that would be lifted as conditions returned to normal. We explained that day would never come, and the very measures introduced supposedly to resolve the crisis were in fact producing another one. Now, the record of who was right, who provided a scientific analysis, is there for all to see. When the coronavirus struck in March, financial markets in the US and worldwide froze, leading to further trillion-dollar interventions by governments and the Fed, along with other central banks, far eclipsing what was done in the aftermath of 2008. A new stage has now begun. It is marked by two interconnected developments: the creation of a vast mountain of debt and fictitious capital as the bourgeoisie, yet again, seeks to bail itself out, and this has only created the conditions for another financial disaster. At the same time, it is the impetus for the homicidal return to work policies as the bourgeoisie seeks to pump value into its financial assets out of the exploitation of the labor of the working class. Throughout our analysis over the past 22 years, we have continually rejected the empty assertions of left economists that the crisis is the result of false policies of sections of the bourgeoisie, and there can be a course correction if only a different mindset is developed and a different set of capitalist politicians elected. The great social ills and dangers confronting mankind, the rise of social inequality, the threat to life itself produced by the gutting of health services in the interest of profit, the rise of authoritarianism and fascist forms of rule, systemic corruption, the ever-growing danger of another world war, to name just some, are rooted in the objective contradictions of the capitalist profit system. How is this crisis to be resolved? In the way Marx outlined in the course of the class struggle. There is no final crisis of the capitalist system. Rather, it will take new and ever more barbaric forms unless and until the working class seizes political power, ends the profit system, and organizes society on the basis of human need. This, you could say, is the alpha and omega of the analysis of political economy by the WSWS. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Nick. I think this is an appropriate time to bring to the attention of all of you who are following this rally that, as I previously stated, the World Socialist website does require financial resources. And so we do ask you to make the largest contribution you can possibly make today to the website. You can go to wsws.org/donate to make this contribution. The work of the site will be expanding. The demands grow ever greater. The technical requirements, the need to develop staff, all of this means that we need money. And so please make a contribution today to the WS. Our next comrade will be Walsh Ateshi of Untitled Socialist. That is the sympathizing group that is setting about to build a section of the International Committee in Turkey. It is, of course, well known that Turkey played a critical role in the life of Leon Trotsky. His first exile from the Soviets, his first and final exile from the Soviet Union in 1929, involved Trotsky's transport to Turkey, where he spent 4 of the most productive years of his life, writing the history of the Russian Revolution, his autobiography, and laying the foundations for what was to be the call for the building of the Fourth International. Today, Turkey plays a critical role in global politics. We spoke before of the pandemic being a trigger event that is accelerating the process of revolution. Well, Turkey itself is being drawn into the maelstrom of world politics, as we see again so clearly in the outbreak of war in the Caucasus between Azerbaijan and Armenia, in the explosive developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. There can be no doubt that in the period ahead, events in Turkey will be of immense significance in the development of the international revolution. And so we are very encouraged and inspired by the efforts being made by socialists in Turkey to establish a section of the International Committee. And certainly that development was made possible through the work of the World Socialist website. So I'd like to ask Comrade Walsh to address this rally and explain the relationship between the development of the International Committee and the work of the WSWS. Comrade Walsh.
Thank you, Comrade Dave. Dear comrades and friends, in the name of the Socialist Eşitlik Grubu, the Socialist Equality Group, in political solidarity with the International Committee of the Fourth International, it is a great honor to have the opportunity to speak to this online rally to celebrate the relaunch of the World Socialist website. Iskra, which was launched to publish in 1900 with the slogan, "From a spark, a fire will flare up," under Vladimir Lenin, represented a critical milestone in the political education of the Russian working class and the building of an independent Marxist party in advance of 1917. The relaunch of the WSWS will be remembered as a critical turning point in the political education of the global working class and the building of the political leadership it needs in the decade of the socialist revolution. Behind this step, which reflects the ICFI's highly conscious political response to the change in the objective conditions, lies the historical, political, and cultural accumulation and continuity of the Marxist movement for more than 170 years. In fact, the launch of the World Socialist website in 1998 has played a decisive role in if our group has represented here today and come a long way in the building of an ICFI section in Turkey. As Comrade David North explained in the welcoming announcement of the relaunch of the WSWS, when the ICFI, quote, seized the opportunity to utilize a technology that would make possible a more favorable alignment between the power of our Marxist Trotskyist ideas and the size of our audience, end quote, this historic step was going to find a response around the world, including Turkey, in the later years. Comrade Halil Çelik, the founder and leader of Socialist Eşitlik, whom we lost tragically at the end of 2018, first met the WSWS in 1999. This encounter made it possible for his group to access the ICFI's documents in the following years. Our group was able to conduct a political struggle against Pavlovites and various kinds of national opportunism in Turkey only on this historically based tradition of the World Trotskyist movement. As Comrade Peter Schwarz explained in his obituary for Comrade Halil, the WSWS made us understood that, quote, the development of the Trotskyist movement in Turkey can take place only on the basis of revolutionary internationalism and requires a thorough understanding of the strategic experiences of the international working class in the course of the 20th century, end quote. Today, insisting upon the complete independence of the international working class from imperialism and all factions of the bourgeoisie, the WSWS is followed a growing interest among the advanced sections of workers, youth, and intellectuals in Turkey, too. Moreover, the WSWS is a website whose analysis and commentary on the developments across the world and the Middle East are closely followed and frequently referenced by various bourgeois newspapers and pseudo-left publications in Turkey. Undoubtedly, what they do not specifically mention is that the WSWS is not a so-called independent news source that can be used whenever they want, but that is the political organ of the International Committee of the Fourth International. The political influence and prestige that the WSWS has in the region is not limited to Turkey. Its irreconcilable and principled opposition to the US-led imperialist wars of aggression against Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, as well as NATO's regime change wars against Libya and Syria since 2011, relentless imperialist wartrees against Iran, and near genocidal war against Yemen, made it highly respected among the working class and oppressed masses across the region. In fact, no other international media organization other than the WSWS has such a rightful reputation. While the middle-class leaderships of the former anti-war protest movements have shifted to the right more than ever after the Iraq War in 2003 and have become pseudo-left supporters of imperialist interventions against Libya and Syria in 2011, the WSWS alone has categorically opposed this imperialist barbarism that killed or wounded millions and displaced millions more across the region, and led to a struggle to build an anti-war socialist movement based on the international working class. Today, the World Socialist website is the main instrument of the struggle to arm and mobilize the international working class with an internationalist and socialist perspective on the conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Caucasus, or the US war preparations against Russia and Iran, which each could trigger a world war. Our political opponents also testify to the prestige of the WSWS in the region and all over the world. When the World Socialist website welcomed the working class opposition to Iran's government and opposed the state suppression at the end of 2017, Ramin Mazahiri, a journalist and an apologist of the so-called Islamic Socialism and Islamic Republic in Iran, expressed admiration for the World Socialist website, even as he opposed this principled attitude taken by the WSWS. He called it, quote, a darn great site, exceptional in most every way, perhaps the most widely visited truly leftist website, and one that is adored in the third world, and finally, deservedly appreciated site around the world, end quote. Despite the social and economic devastation of the 30 years of imperialist war across the Middle East, millions of people from across the region joined the ranks of the international working class as a result of the globalization of production in the same period. This young proletariat will find on the World Socialist website the political weapon it needs in the struggle for international socialism and against imperialism and reactionary bourgeois regimes in the region in the decade of the socialist revolution we have entered. I would like to take this occasion to urge our readers to take action and join us to expand the publication of the WSWS in Turkish, Kurdish, Arabic, Persian, and other languages spoken across the region in order to grow the readership of it and to build the sections of the ISFI in the Middle East. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Comrade Walsh. In the history of the international socialist movement, there is no experience more tragic and fateful than the defeat of the German working class in 1933 with the coming to power of Hitler and his Nazi regime. That catastrophe the outcome of the betrayals of Stalinism and social democracy was to have incalculable consequences. It is a historical fact that the events of 1933 and their aftermath profoundly vindicated the struggle which Trotsky had led from exile in Turkey against the catastrophic policies of the Weimar Social Democrats and Stalinism in the notorious third period of ultra-left adventurism. The Stalinists rejected the policy of a united front, claiming that there existed no difference between social democracy and fascism, and absurdly predicting that the victory of Hitler would create the best conditions for the rapid victory of the Communist Party. And it was after that defeat and the failure of the Third International to make a necessary criticism of the false policies that Trotsky issued the call for the founding of a Fourth International. Now, in the aftermath of the Second World War and the collapse of the Nazi regime, it was claimed by many that fascism was merely an aberration. The German historians, anxious to develop apologias for what had happened, frequently compared the Nazi regime to something of a car wreck on a highway, unforeseeable, and something which would never be repeated again. But once again, we see the revival of fascist movements in Germany. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Jews are attacked in the streets of Germany, and even so great an artist as Igor Levit, the pianist, as we recently reported in the World Socialist website, has been threatened. And again, it is the Trotskyist movement which is both sounding the alarm and showing the way forward in the fight against fascism. In fact, it has been the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei since 2014, which has repeatedly warned of the growth of fascism in Germany. Today, the editor of the German section of the World Socialist website, Johannes Stern, will speak on developments in Germany and the policies of the SGP. Comrade Johannes.
Thank you. On behalf of the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei, the German section of the ICFI, I would like to bring revolutionary greetings to this rally celebrating the relaunch of the World Socialist website. As Comrade David said, I will focus my remarks on the critical role of the WSWS in mobilizing the international working class against the rise of the far right and the growing danger of fascism. Our definition of the COVID-19 pandemic as a trigger event certainly applies to the ruling class's turn to dictatorial and fascistic forms of rule. The events in the US on the eve of the presidential elections make clear how openly the bourgeoisie is once again relying on fascist forces to impose its policy of militarism, social attacks, and herd immunity against the growing opposition among workers and youth. 2 weeks ago, the revelation of a plot to kidnap and assassinate Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer exposed the existence of a far-right terrorist network across the US. While the bourgeois media, the Democrats, and their pseudo-left appendages do everything to either conceal or downplay it, the WSWS provides extensive coverage of these extremely dangerous events. The great revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg once said, "To say what is remains the most revolutionary act." This is exactly what the World Socialist website does. The fascist militias are part of a comprehensive strategy by US President Donald Trump not to recognize his likely defeat in the elections and remain in power through a fascist coup. In sounding the alarm, the WSWS insists that the working class is not just confronted with Trump. The gangster in the White House is only the embodiment of a decayed and brutalized ruling class whose degeneration is symptomatic of the historical crisis of the capitalist system. Trump's policies are more a continuation than a break with those of his Republican and Democratic predecessors. And they are essentially shared by the bourgeoisie internationally. As Comrade David said, this is especially true for Germany. In the face of the deepest economic and social crisis since the 1930s and growing tensions between the major powers, the ruling class in Germany is showing its true face. As it returns to an aggressive foreign and great power policy, it builds a fascist party, the AfD, and grooms neo-Nazi networks in the army and police. Leading academics with close ties to the established parties and the state relativize and whitewash the crimes of the Nazis. And 75 years after the Holocaust, also the poison of anti-Semitism is back. Last week, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of the largest daily newspapers in Germany, published an anti-Semitic diatribe against world-famous pianist Igor Levit, who has spoken out powerfully against the resurgence of fascism in Germany. And other right-wing papers immediately joined the attack. The goal of the campaign is clear. It aims to make anti-Semitic arguments presentable and to intimidate all opposition. The bourgeoisie is terrified by the growing movement among workers and youth to the left. And above all, it fears that this opposition is increasingly coming together with the political perspective and activity of the WSWS and the ICFI. In response to our campaign against the revival of German militarism and fascism, the German media has described the World Socialist website as wirkungsmächtig, extremely effective. And the SGP has been placed on the watch list of the Verfassungsschutz. That's the Germany's domestic secret service. We can be sure that the forces of counter-revolution see the relaunch and this rally as a threat. The new site provides the working class with a powerful weapon to advance the fight against fascism. We have curated a special topic page which presents not only our current statements and analysis, but also important videos, lectures, and books by leaders of the IC, as well as some of the most important writings by Leon Trotsky. His analysis and perspective remain essential to understand what fascism is and how to fight it. Trotsky explained in 1933 that fascism is the mobilization of the ruined petty bourgeoisie in the interests of finance capital, as a, quote, battering ram against the organizations of the working class and the institutions of democracy, end of quote. Today's fascist organizations are not based on a mass movement, but are rather the product of a conspiracy of the ruling classes. But this makes them not less dangerous. Their function is the same, to enforce a barbaric agenda of exploitation, social inequality, and war. As in the 1930s, the great challenge is to provide the great mass of the working population with a clear program, perspective, and leadership. The fight against fascism and war requires the independent political mobilization of the working class, united internationally on the basis of its common class interests against capitalism and for socialism. It's a matter of record that only the WSWS and the ICFI advanced this historical perspective. Trotsky would not only be proud of the new site, he would be convinced that it will become the main tool for workers and youth to not only defeat fascism this time, but establish socialism internationally. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Johannes. Our next speaker will be Comrade Chris Marsden, the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Britain. Comrade Chris has played a leading role in the work of the International Committee since 1985, when he, along with Comrade Dave Hyland, played a critical role in the fight against the betrayal of the Workers' Revolutionary Party and fought to defend Trotskyism against the WRP's betrayal of the principles which it had in the past defended. That fight has been vindicated. The struggle in Britain is immensely difficult and challenging. Britain, the oldest imperialist party, is also the home of the oldest opportunist parties and the most sophisticated forms of the defense of bourgeois politics within the labor movement and the working class. The powerful English working class, which inspired Marx and Engels and played a critical role in the development of the international Marxist movement, has also been the scene of this very, very difficult struggle against opportunism, which persists to this day, and most recently in the degrading experience of Corbynism, the latest chapter in the long and squalid history of opportunism and anti-Marxism in Britain. Our party in Britain has stood out in exposing this particular form of opportunism, upholding a revolutionary perspective. And this struggle has immense lessons for the working class throughout the world. So I'd like to invite Comrade Chris to speak today and impart to this meeting some of the lessons which our movement has drawn from this critical experience and, in fact, the long experience in the struggle against opportunism in Britain. Comrade Chris.
Thank you, Comrade Dave. I mean, first of all, I'd just like to say that I'm speaking to you tonight during the Congress of the Socialist Equality Party in the United Kingdom, which is discussing a draft resolution laying out the political axis for the work of the section during the explosive period of class struggles that lie ahead. All our delegates are listening in, and everyone knows that the relaunch of the World Socialist website provides a central axis for everything we're setting out to accomplish. That is the building of a new revolutionary leadership in the working class. Our resolution states the central political responsibility of the SEP is to take full part in the development of the World Socialist website as the authoritative voice of Marxism and the instrument through which the world working class will be unified in a struggle for socialism. The World Socialist website was relaunched on October the 2nd with a major redesign that is aesthetically pleasing and provides for heightened functionality. But the redesign was guided by an understanding that the historic crisis of the world capitalist system, accelerated by the coronavirus pandemic, is generating immense resurgence of interest within the working class in socialist politics, history, and theory. Now, by way of illustration of the points that Comrade David raised, I want to explain what the work of the World Socialist website means for the political education and clarification of the working class. Our Congress resolution pays very close attention to the bitter experiences made during the 5 years when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. Now, as many of you will know, Corbyn was elected in 2015 on a mandate to drive out the Blairite right wing and take up a struggle against the despised Conservative government that had imposed savage austerity measures that had left millions in poverty and millions more struggling to survive. Instead, we are addressing these strategic experiences under conditions where Corbyn's betrayal of those who voted for him through his opposition to all efforts to kick out the Blairites, allowing a free vote on the bombardment of Syria, renewing the Trident nuclear weapons program, and supporting NATO, refusing to oppose the witch hunt of his own supporters as anti-Semites, and his unswerving opposition to any struggle against the Tories, ended in a disaster. Now, Labour's crushing defeat in the December 2019 general election brought Boris Johnson to power, heading a criminal government whose herd immunity policy has led to tens of thousands of deaths during the pandemic. Corbyn, we now know, was told of this policy by Johnson and kept quiet about it. He then handed power in the Labour Party to Sir Keir Starmer, who, taking his cue from Corbyn, has pledged himself to constructive opposition to the Tories, his words, which means active collusion in the back to work, reopen schools drive that is guaranteeing tens of thousands more deaths. Now, this is the political legacy of the man hailed by all of the pseudo-left groups in Britain and internationally as the leader of a socialist rebirth of the Labour Party, the British equivalent of Bernie Sanders in the US, and the wave of the future. Now, I'm sure you can imagine the political confusion this would create if this grotesque lie wasn't challenged, but it was. Our resolution cites an SEP statement from 2015, that is prior to Corbyn's election as Labour leader, which based itself on the historical character and experiences of the working class with social democracy, and in particular its left varieties. We insisted that no change of Labour leader, nor even an influx of left-leaning members, could change the historically and programmatically determined character of Labour as a right-wing bourgeois party, complicit in all the crimes of British imperialism, one that has functioned as the principal political opponent of socialism for more than a century. That's the historical approach that we took. It then cites a December the 14th statement by the World Socialist website editorial board, which marked the final electoral debacle of Labour, which linked Corbyn's treacherous record not only to the experiences in Britain, but to the betrayal of Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and similar pseudo-left formations internationally, all of which represented a privileged upper middle class stratum with a vested interest in defending capitalism. Now, that statement explained what is exposed in Labour's debacle is a type of politics that seeks to deny the revolutionary nature of the working class. Under Corbyn's leadership, Labour ditched any class appeal in favour of promoting an agenda based on the identity politics of race, nationality, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. The ideologist of the middle-class left, Chantal Mouffe, described Corbyn as potentially the most successful example of a new wave of left populism, because he stands at the head of a great party, this is her words, and enjoys the support of the trade unions. The outcome, she said, would depend on his rejecting, quote, the traditional left political frontier established on the basis of class. From this, we concluded, Corbyn's debacle is the exposure not just of the Labour Party, but of the entire perspective of the parliamentary road to socialism. The great questions of war, poverty, and social inequality are not going to be solved with cleverly run election campaigns. The precondition for resolving any of the great social problems confronting mankind is a massive mobilization of the working class and the intensification of the class struggle on a global scale. Only a movement that identifies itself with this struggle, that breaks through the miserable nationalist debate over Brexit and fights for a programme of international proletarian unity, will be able to win the confidence of the working class and lead it in the fight for socialism. Now, this is what the struggle against opportunism means. It's the fight for principle, for a historically based analysis, and the perspective of socialist internationalism against any adaptation to nationalism and the seeking of shortcuts based on adaptations to the domination of the working class by the labour and trade union bureaucracy. It's statements like this that provide a strategic orientation for the working class, that stress the need to break from the perspective of national reformism, to shake off the stranglehold of labour, and adopt the perspective of socialist internationalism. It's a perspective that's fought in irreconcilable struggle against all of the pseudo-left opportunist tendencies. And we know, moreover, that any worker or young person reading it can follow links to a vast trove of political analysis fighting for this perspective. Over 100 articles on Corbynism, on other pseudo-left formations, polemics against the pseudo-left groups, on the role of the trade unions in betraying workers' struggles, links to historical articles on Trotsky, on the Labour Party, on Stalinism, on Brexit, the mounting inter-imperialist antagonisms that lead into trade and military war, and the necessity to base the struggles of the working class on internationalism, on the struggle for the United Socialist States of Europe. When young people and workers begin probing the question of Corbynism, as analysed by the Socialist Equality Party and by the International Committee, and this is only one example among many, that worker or young person can begin their political education as a Trotskyist. Now, that is what the redesign of the World Socialist website makes possible. It will provide the basis for the education of the millions of working people coming into struggle, to educate them in the programme and principles of socialism as embodied in the International Committee. The World Socialist website is a pole of attraction for the best elements in the working class, and it is the forum through which the International Committee will be built as the World Party of Socialist Revolution. That's what the struggle against opportunism represents. That is what we represent as a political tendency. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Comrade Chris. Our next speaker will be Comrade Alex Lantier, the leader of the French section of the International Committee, the Parti Égalité Socialiste. The struggle against opportunism in Europe, of course, and in the Fourth International has a long experience, which dates right back, of course, to the very founding of the International Committee in 1953 and the development of Pabloism, a tendency which rejected the fight for the building of independent Trotskyist parties and developed a perspective for subordinating the revolutionary movement to all varieties of not just Stalinism, but petty bourgeois radicalism. In the recent period, the working class of Europe has gone through a series of critical strategic experiences. The experience with Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, two parties that were presented by the Pabloites and various representatives of pseudo-leftism as a new path for the working class. Historical experience, political reality has thoroughly exposed that perspective. And in the analysis of these tendencies, Comrade Alex has played a very critical role in his many writings, both on Syriza, Podemos, and on the struggle against forces such as those of Mélenchon in France. So I think his contribution today is very timely, as the question of the fight for the building of the independent revolutionary movement of the working class in opposition to all varieties of opportunism acquires acute significance. Comrade Alex.
Thank you, Comrade Dave. Celebrating the relaunch of the World Socialist website means to recall that its authority has been built over decades of unrelenting struggle against the falsification of Marxism. The World Socialist website was launched, as Comrade Dave noted in his opening remarks, shortly after the dissolution of the Soviet Union by the Stalinist bureaucracy. It insisted this event did not end the struggle of the international working class for socialism. Rather, it exposed the nationalist perspective of socialism in one country that Stalinism had advanced against Trotsky and the Trotskyist movement. Now, the World Socialist website's Marxist internationalist perspective set it on an opposed class trajectory to a layer of middle-class parties that today are based on a fusion of Stalinism with identity politics. The ruling establishment has constantly marketed this layer of parties as the left. And an especially confusing aspect of political life in our epoch is this. It is precisely when these supposedly quote-unquote left parties exert the most influence that the working class suffers the worst defeats. And the World Socialist website has established itself as an irreplaceable source of analysis and perspective for workers to grasp the role of these political tendencies in the international class struggle. In the 2000s, in statements that now appear prophetic, the WSWS warned against parties like Greece's Syriza party, built on the left populist theories of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, or France's Pabloite New Anti-Capitalist Party, or NPA. The NPA asserted, in line with its Pabloite historical roots, that Trotskyism was old, irrelevant, and an obstacle to politically necessary alliances with Stalinist and Social Democratic parties. The warnings made by the WSWS were confirmed in the first great revolutionary experience of the working class in the 21st century, the 2011 uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia. Egypt's so-called revolutionary socialists turned out to be a party that opposed both socialism and revolution. They peddled first promises that a military junta, then Islamist President Mohamed Morsi, and finally the rebel Tamarod movement would help create a new democratic space in Egypt. Heavily promoted in international media, they fell silent after the Tamarod movement helped Egyptian dictator Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to launch a bloody coup. As for the NPA, it fraudulently hailed as democratic revolutions the imperialist proxy wars launched in Libya and Syria by CIA-backed Islamist militias. These wars have now claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and forced tens of millions of people to flee their homes. To identify and explain these parties' role, the World Socialist website developed the term pseudo-left. The pseudo-left, WSWS explained, are forces using, quote, populist slogans and democratic phrases to promote the socioeconomic interests of privileged and affluent strata of the middle class, unquote. The pseudo-left, we warned, supports capitalism, opposes the class struggle, embraces philosophical irrationalism, and supports neo-colonial wars. The events of the past decade have unfailingly vindicated this assessment. While all the pseudo-left parties internationally hailed the election of the Syriza party in Greece in 2015, the WSWS alone warned that its election promises to end EU austerity were shameless lies. In power, Syriza made no appeal to the European working class to defend Greece against the European Union. Instead, even after organizing a referendum on austerity, in which the no vote won decisively, it imposed billions of euros in social cuts and built up a network of concentration camps for refugees. Today, the Spanish sister party of both Syriza and of France's NPA, Podemos, is in power in Spain. What is its record? It has raised spending on the army and the police, implemented social austerity, and supported the jailing of Catalan nationalist political prisoners demanded by Spain's neo-fascists. Podemos's policy on COVID-19 is herd immunity. Now, amid mounting class struggles around the world, from France's Yellow Vest protests to the mass teachers and auto strikes in the United States and many countries beyond, the pseudo-left is ever more openly hostile to the workers. It all but proclaims, yes, we are the pseudo-left. In her 2018 book, For a Left Populism, Chantal Mouffe rejected revolution. What is urgently needed is a left populist strategy aimed at the construction of a quote-unquote people, combining the variety of democratic resistances, she wrote, adding, this does not require a revolutionary break with the liberal democratic regime. Mouffe even explicitly attacked what she called, quote, sectors of the left who keep reducing politics to the contradiction of capital against labor and attribute an ontological privilege to the working class presented as the vehicle for socialist revolution. Well, against the pseudo-left, we plead guilty of fighting to offer Marxist leadership to the international working class as the leading force in the world socialist revolution. The relaunched WSWS offers unprecedented technology to present Marxist analyses and historical perspectives to workers and youth around the world. It is the basis for a renaissance of Marxism and the construction of sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International opposing the pseudo-left in countries across Europe and the globe. Thank you.
The struggle against imperialism, and particularly American imperialism, is a fundamental responsibility and duty of a genuine revolutionary movement. The World Socialist website has written voluminously on the wars which have been conducted, in particular by American imperialism, over the past 30 years. And in the analysis of these criminal activities, Comrade Bill Van Auken has played a central role. Having joined the International Committee of the Fourth International in its American section a half-century ago, Comrade Bill's writings over so many decades has played a critical role in educating the working class and developing an understanding of the policies and which motivate American imperialism and the methods through which it has to be fought by the international working class. He, of course, has also written extensively on developments in Latin America and throughout the world. So I am very proud to ask Comrade Bill to address the meeting today and to focus particular attention on the present crisis. Bill.
Thank you, Comrade David. The politically vital transformations that are being carried out now on the World Socialist website are based on powerful foundations laid over the past 22 years of its continuous publication. Throughout that period, the World Socialist website established an unrivaled record in its daily analysis and exposure of the crimes of US imperialism, as well as in the fight to build a global anti-war movement based upon the working class. This record and the invaluable political lessons of our response to 3 decades of imperialist war are now made far more accessible on the relaunched WSWS to its growing international audience of workers and youth. I would urge every listener to review this record through the fascinating and comprehensive exhibits of the new WSWS represented under the topics of war and militarism and anti-imperialism. In this struggle, we have stood on the shoulders of the great Marxists of the 20th century, first and foremost Lenin and Trotsky, who established that both war and revolution were the inevitable outcomes, in the words of Trotsky, of a revolt of the forces of production against the political form of nation and state. This fundamental Marxist conception that has guided our work was further developed by the International Committee of the Fourth International in its response to capitalist globalization and an unprecedented integration of international production, with its immense sharpening of antagonisms between the major imperialist powers, as well as the unification of the working class in a common process of production and creating the conditions for its unification in a common revolutionary struggle. As other comrades have noted, the World Socialist website was launched in February 1998 in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and in the teeth of the triumphalist proclamations of an end of history, yet another American century, and a unipolar moment concretized in the first one-sided war of US aggression against Iraq. The WSWS began online publication during the buildup of US imperialism to another war of aggression, this time in the Balkans, with the 1999 US-led NATO bombing of Serbia. The war against Serbia was launched in supposed response to the highly exaggerated claims of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, carried out by the Serbian regime headed by the demonized Slobodan Milosevic. The WSWS, however, exposed the far deeper objective sources of this war, rooted in the crisis of US and world imperialism and the complex development of the class struggle in the Balkans. Its analysis was summed up in the essay written by David North, After the Slaughter, Political Lessons of the Balkan War. It stated, far from representing a humanitarian break with the past, the Balkan War of 1999 signals the virulent resurgence of its most malicious characteristics, the legitimization of the marked use of overwhelming military power against small countries in pursuit of strategic big power interests, the cynical violation of the principle of national sovereignty, and the de facto reestablishment of colonialist forms of subjugation, and the revival of inter-imperialist antagonisms that carry with them the seeds of a new world war. This prescient analysis has stood the test of time. In the course of the US intervention in the Balkans, the World Socialist website identified a new constituency for imperialism among layers of the upper middle class whose wealth had risen with the financial boom. This included elements that had participated in the protest movement against the Vietnam War, who now rally to the filthy banner of human rights imperialism. Their interests would find political expression over the entire succeeding period, as the previous speaker has noted, in the development of pseudo-left tendencies that support imperialism, oppose socialism, and are hostile to the independent struggles of the working class. The WSWS has waged a relentless struggle against this international socio-political layer and its support for US imperialist war from Serbia to Syria. The World Socialist website established an unparalleled record of articles and commentary on the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, their origins, and their far-reaching political consequences. In the nearly 2 decades since, the perspective advanced by the WSWS since the very day of the attacks has been entirely confirmed, a vindication of the power of Marxist analysis and principled politics. The day after the 9/11 attacks, the World Socialist website warned, quote, "It is the policies pursued by the United States, driven by the strategic and financial interests of the ruling elite, which laid the foundations for the nightmare that unfolded on Tuesday. The actions now being contemplated by the Bush administration will only set the stage for further catastrophes." It further explained that, quote, "From the standpoint of the American government, the crusade against terrorism has been far more a campaign of propaganda to justify US military violence around the world than a conscientious effort to protect the American people." Subsequent events have thoroughly vindicated this analysis. The war on terror became the pretext for a renewal of imperialist neocolonialism on a massive scale, including the launching of the criminal invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. They were followed by wars for regime change in Libya and Syria, in which Washington, under the Democratic administration of Barack Obama, employed as proxies the very same al-Qaeda forces it was supposedly combating. US clandestine murder and torture operations have been carried out in dozens of countries around the world, while the supposed terror threat has been the pretext for the wholesale attacks on democratic rights and spying on the people of the United States and the entire planet. The WSWS has worked tirelessly to expose the crimes of US imperialism, which have killed and maimed millions and destroyed entire societies from Afghanistan and Iraq to Libya, Syria, Yemen, and beyond in its quest for global domination. It has also fought intransigently for the anti-war program that the International Committee of the Fourth International elaborated in its 2016 statement, Socialism and the Fight Against War. The ICFI advanced the indispensable principles for building a genuine anti-war movement, insisting that it must be founded on the politically independent struggle of the working class, unified across national boundaries. It also stated that it must be founded on an international struggle for the abolition of the capitalist nation-state system and the creation of a world socialist federation. It stated, quote, "The permanent war of the bourgeoisie must be answered with the perspective of permanent revolution by the working class." We hold this rally today under conditions of growing threats of world war. The US military apparatus has announced that the war on terror has been supplanted by great power conflicts, and it is preparing accordingly. Within the past week, the US and its NATO allies have held dress rehearsals for the nuclear bombing of Russia, while the US Navy and Marines have conducted island hopping maneuvers in preparation for a war in the Pacific with China. The global COVID-19 pandemic has served not to blunt the war drive, but rather to accelerate it. At the same time, there was a powerful resurgence of the struggles of the international working class and the mass protests from Nigeria to Chile and Thailand, to the resistance of teachers, healthcare workers, and others throughout the Americas, Europe, and beyond, to the homicidal response of the bourgeoisie to the COVID-19 pandemic. I would urge all the readers and supporters of the WSWS to utilize this priceless resource to educate yourselves as Marxists and to make the decision to join the Socialist Equality Party or to build new sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International in countries where such parties do not yet exist. In the coming days, the relaunch of the World Socialist website will prove its worth as the most powerful weapon in the revolutionary war against war that must be waged by the international working class for its own survival.
Thank you, Comrade Van. In the struggle for Trotskyism, a central battleground has been Latin America. And it was there that the treachery of Pabloism, of the revision of a Trotskyist program, has found its most tragic expression. Again and again, we have seen how efforts were made to promote and legitimize as alternatives to Marxism such retrograde tendencies and reactionary tendencies as Pabloism, Chavismo, as alternatives, to present Castroism and guerrilla warfare as the wave of the future, and to continuously denigrate and downplay and dismiss the essential revolutionary role of the working class based on the strategy of permanent revolution. That is the fundamental conception that the tasks of the democratic revolution can only be achieved through the conquest of power by the working class and the establishment of proletarian power and the implementation of a genuine socialist program. We're very, very pleased that the work of the World Socialist website is growing support within Latin America. And in the recent period, we have made considerable strides in attracting new forces in Latin America. Among those are a group of dedicated comrades who are setting out to build a section of the International Committee in Brazil and throughout Latin America. I'd like to welcome Comrade Tomas Castaneras to address this rally. Comrade Tomas.
Thank you, Dave, and greetings, comrades. The launching of the new World Socialist website is an important historical achievement of the Trotskyist movement that will play a critical role in the development of a revolutionary perspective for the working class in Brazil and Latin America. The Latin American region is immersed in a deep social, political, and economic crisis that has been sharply exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. Although it represents 10% of the world's population, Latin America accounts for 1/3 of all COVID-19 deaths. A horrifying death toll of more than 380,000 continues to rise, with several hundred losing their lives to the disease every day in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia. This is the result of the absolutely criminal policies of the capitalist governments in confronting the pandemic. Their homicidal response included the virtual non-existence of testing, preventing workers from carrying out social distancing, unequipped and overcrowded hospitals, and even official corruption, diverting resources destined to fight the pandemic into their own pockets. At the same time, the pandemic has profoundly shaken Latin America's economies, which already suffered from 6 years of almost zero growth. The United Nations Economic Committee for Latin America and the Caribbean predicted a 9% drop in the region's GDP in 2020. The total number of Latin Americans living in poverty is expected to rise from 186 million to 231 million, and 80% of the region's population will be forced to live on under $500 per month. Unemployment levels are skyrocketing. Official unemployment, according to the UN, will grow 5.4% in 2020 compared to 2019, an impact 9 times higher than that recorded after the 2008 global financial crash. In Brazil, for the first time, more than half of the working age population is unemployed. Among youth, the official unemployment rate is twice as high as in the rest of the population. The young generation of the Latin American working class has absolutely no perspectives under capitalism. On the other hand, the capitalist oligarchy is enjoying a bonanza despite the decline in the real economy and the devastating conditions of the masses. The 73 billionaires in the region have accumulated almost $50 billion just in the first 5 months of the pandemic, which represents 10 billion more than Bolivia's total GDP in 2019. These developments in the objective social crisis will have a major impact on the consciousness of hundreds of millions. A recent article in The Economist entitled "Latin America's New Poor" expressed the deep concerns of the international ruling class over the developing political situation. It concluded, quote, "The tens of millions of new poor have reasons for resentment. They may not accept their fate quietly. That is likely to shape the region's politics for years to come. It is not whether they will accept their fate. They are already fighting back against it. The mass protests against social inequality that rocked countries like Chile and Ecuador at the end of 2019 have strongly returned in recent months. With their anger fueled by the disastrous COVID policies, millions of workers and youth have once again taken to the streets in Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia, protesting against police violence, authoritarian regimes, and their starvation policies. Militant working class strikes from app delivery workers to nurses have also spread throughout the region, from Mexico to Brazil. The growing demand of the working masses for social justice cannot be met within the existing social relations. As the ruling class as a whole shifts to the right, the remnants of the bourgeois national governments known as the Pink Tide, which rose to power in several Latin American countries in the 2000s, assume increasingly reactionary positions. The government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico has, as much as the government of Brazil's fascistic president Jair Bolsonaro, spread lies and disorganized the fight against the pandemic, while forcing workers into contaminated workplaces to generate profits and guarantee the privileges of the parasitic capitalist oligarchy. Under the leadership of the Peronist Alberto Fernandez, Argentina is emerging as a country with one of the fastest growing COVID-19 death rates as the disease spreads in the poor working class areas known as vicious miserias. In Brazil, the Workers' Party, PT, rules states that are among the most severely impacted by the coronavirus, where they are now forcing the reopening of schools. Their response to the growing social crisis is an open orientation to the military and to nationalism. Nothing different can be expected from a return to power by Morales Mas in Bolivia. Having been elected in the middle of rebellious protests by workers and peasants, they offer nothing more than starvation bonuses and a national unity pact with the fascists. The World Socialist website has waged a consistent struggle against any subordination of the working class to the national bourgeoisie, and has exposed the radical and even socialist rhetoric of figures like Venezuela's Hugo Chavez as a fraudulent cover for their capitalist policies and accommodation to imperialism. The WSWS has also demolished the petty bourgeois theories of the pseudo-left, including the heirs of the Public United Secretariat that have portrayed these governments as a new road to socialism. This combat has been based on the principles defended by the International Committee of the Fourth International and its protracted fight against Pabloid revisionism. The promotion by the Pabloids of a wide range of petty bourgeois and national bourgeois leaderships, such as Castroism and Peronism, as political substitutes for the proletariat and its party, the Fourth International, played a critical role in the betrayal of the revolutionary struggles of the Latin American working class in the latter half of the 20th century. As we enter the period that the International Committee has scientifically described as the decade of socialist revolution, the central question of building a genuine revolutionary leadership in the working class depends on the assimilation of this record of struggle. The WSWS, in its new and more advanced form, is going to interact with the developing struggles of workers and youth in Latin America, arming them with the historical experience and revolutionary program of the Trotskyist movement, connecting them to the global movement of the international working class, and laying the foundations for new sections of this ICFI in every country.
Thank you very much, Comrade Tomas. I again would like to urge our listeners, supporters, those who are following this meeting to make a donation to the work of the WSWS, to access ws.org/donate. And also to very seriously, if you're not yet involved in the work of the International Committee or a section of the World of the ICFI, to contact the ICFI and the WSWS. We have, you go to wsws.org/join. Wherever you are in the world, we will route your request for information to the section nearest to your own location. Our next speaker will be a comrade who has been a leading revolutionary journalist for also close to a half century, Comrade Patrick Martin. His knowledge of American politics and all its complexities and twists and turns, I think, is without equal. And I must also add that he is among the most prolific of the writers for the World Socialist website. You can click on the bylines of all the writers of the WSWS to access their more complete list of their writings. And if you do so for the writings of Comrade Patrick Martin, you will be occupied and will be fascinated and enlightened for a great deal of time. The political situation in the United States, of course, today is entirely fraught. We are now on the eve of an election which has no parallel in the history of the United States. The only time it could be compared to is perhaps the election of 1860, where a section of the country refused to accept the outcome of a democratic election. Now we have a situation where the President of the United States is engaged in what is openly preparations for a violent rejection of the outcome of an election, regardless of the outcome, and even a formal acceptance of the election of his adversary will not bring an end to the conspiracies which now pervade American politics. I'm speaking from Michigan, where, as you know, if you've been following the developments of the World Socialist website, and it's only the WSWS which has reported consistently on this event, a plot was underway, encouraged by Trump and broad sections of the Republican Party to kidnap and assassinate the Democratic governor of the state. America has become a land of conspiracies, of talks of coups, and this marks, of course, a new period of political crisis. So I'd like to invite Comrade Martin to discuss the political situation in the United States and its global implications. Comrade Martin.
Thank you, Comrade Dave. It is an honor and a privilege to address this international online meeting. We are marking the relaunch of the World Socialist website October 2nd as a significant landmark in the development of the World Trotskyist movement. Comrade Dave has already made reference to the decision by the International Committee of the Fourth International to begin publishing the WSWS in February 1998. For those in my generation, it is remarkable that we have already spent nearly half our political lives writing for an internet audience, one that simply did not exist when we entered politics. Prior to the WSWS, we published the Bulletin in the US weekly and twice weekly, and the International Workers Bulletin, weekly and biweekly, print publications through which we fought to reach and politically educate the American and international working class. It does not diminish these early efforts in the slightest to note that today articles on the WSWS that go viral, such as our reports on school cuts in Massachusetts, or the assassination of anti-fascist protester Michael Reinl on the West Coast, or the numerous commentaries on the 1619 Project, reach a larger audience in a few days than we could reach by distributing a printed newspaper in months, if not years. After all, it was the work of the Bulletin and the newspapers published by our sister parties throughout the world that, through an intransigent struggle for Marxist principles, laid the basis for the creation of the WSWS, the first truly global publication of the international working class. The WSWS is now read in virtually every country and on every continent. When we launched the WSWS in February 1998, the United States was, as it is today, in the throes of a major political crisis which threatened to topple a president. Although in retrospect, Clinton's relationship with Monica Lewinsky, which was leveraged by his ultra-right opponents to impeach him, was only the initial form of the breakdown of American democracy that is culminating today in the fascistic conspiracies of President Trump. But we recognized then, at the very earliest stage of this process, that the attempt to oust a twice-elected president through the methods of a sex scandal involved significant questions of democratic rights. We said that the working class should not simply stand aside, but should intervene in the political crisis of the ruling elite and fight for its independent interests. We accordingly opposed the impeachment, despite our hostility to the Democratic Party and to the policies of American imperialism under Clinton. From the onset of the WSWS, we began daily postings, 5 days a week. This made possible nearly day-to-day analysis and commentary on the US political crisis. In that first year of publication, we wrote more than 100 articles on various aspects of the Clinton crisis, which comprise a unique political record and established a pattern for other crises and major political events, both in the United States and around the world. The following year, in the course of the US-NATO war against Serbia, we expanded publication to 6 days a week. In the initial welcome published on the WSWS on February 14, 1998, we declared the WSWS to be the official voice of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement. We wrote, the World Socialist website, published by the coordinated efforts of ICFI members in Asia, Australia, Europe, and North America, takes as its starting point the international character of the class struggle. It assesses political developments in every country from the standpoint of the world crisis of capitalism and the political tasks confronting the international working class. Flowing from this perspective, it resolutely opposes all forms of chauvinism and national parochialism. This political standpoint of revolutionary internationalism has been vindicated in the course of many struggles of the working class around the world, but above all, by the objective development of world capitalism itself. The coronavirus pandemic is not the first time that the international working class has experienced a crisis of global dimensions, which has affected workers throughout the world more or less simultaneously. This was the character of the war on terror that began after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, and then the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which provoked a worldwide outpouring of political opposition, the biggest anti-war movement in history. In 2008, 2009 came the global financial crisis, which plunged the whole of world capitalism into the deepest slump since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And now we have the coronavirus pandemic, which affects working people in the same way in every corner of the globe. We noted at the time the WSWS was launched that 80 to 100 million people had access to the internet. This audience was dismissed as insignificant or highly privileged by some of our enemies in the pseudo-left. One group claimed that we were fleeing into cyberspace as though the internet was a backwater or a desert island on which we were about to become marooned. Today, there are 4.6 billion people who are active users of the internet and many more who have access to it. As the internet audience has expanded, so has our work to reach it. During its first year, the WSWS published about 1,500 articles in English. Over a number of years, this rose to more than 4,000 a year. Since the first major redesign of the site in 2008, which introduced the perspective column, we have regularly published more than 5,000 articles a year. In August of last year, 2019, the cumulative total reached 75,000 in English. And today that figure is well over 82,000 after a year in which both our audience and the work of the IC sections contributing to the WSWS reached new highs. Working people, and particularly young people all over the world, find their struggles and political experiences connecting internationally. And that is why they respond so strongly to a website that seeks to consciously unite the working class of the world. In this sense, the WSWS represents something completely new. It is the voice of the international working class, conscious of itself and its historical mission, and preparing for the overthrow of capitalism on a world scale and the building of a new international socialist society.
Thank you, Comrade Patrick. It has always been the position of the International Committee, its sections, and the World Socialist website that only a movement which is pitched to the highest political and theoretical level can reach the working class. And it must be said that the range of coverage of the site is attracting ever greater interest and, of course, greater recognition within ever broader sections of the working class. And the initiatives that we have taken to intervene in the daily struggles of the working class is, of course, as well acquiring an ever-growing audience. I just would like to point out that the articles which the WSWS have written dealing specifically with issues related to the daily struggles of the working class are attracting substantial readership. For example, an article written titled "Massachusetts School District Gets Rid of Art, Music, and PE Teachers for the Coming School Year" has been read by 696,954 readers. An article which called for the shutdown of the auto industry to halt the spread of the coronavirus was read by 131,000 readers. And it should be pointed out that just 4 days after that article was published, the first walkouts took place in Michigan plants, which forced a broader shutdown of the industry in response to the coronavirus. An article detailing the layoff of 275,000 teachers has been read by 97,822 readers. And a similar pattern is to be seen in the coverage of international working class struggles. A letter from a frontline nurse at UK's Royal Bournemouth Hospital had 96,347 readers. An article on the halting of production at Fiat Chrysler in Windsor, Assembly in Canada, as a consequence of the coronavirus danger, has had 44,272 readers. Our next speaker will be a comrade who has played a major role in developing the industrial work of the International Committee and the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, Comrade Jerry White. The ICFI and the SEP in the United States has made major initiatives to promote the formation of factory committees, worker safety committees, independently and in opposition to the collaborationist policies of the union bureaucracies, which have done nothing and refuse to take any action to protect and defend the working class. And these initiatives are, as you can see from the readership, acquiring an ever-growing measure of support within the working class. So I'd like to ask Comrade Jerry White to discuss these initiatives and their political significance to the rally. Comrade Jerry.
Thank you, Comrade Dave. As the other speakers explained, when the World Socialist website was initially launched in 1998, the ICFI set out as its task the revival of a socialist culture in the international working class and the preparation of a leadership for the next stage of the capitalist crisis and resurgence of the class struggle, and to be the practical organizer of the world proletariat to achieve its revolutionary tasks. We are relaunching the WSWS amid the greatest breakdown of the world capitalist system, with more than 1 million dead and an economic and social catastrophe not seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The mass slaughter in the European battlefields of World War I was not ended until the entry of the working class. The same is true in the present, when the working class once again faces issues of life and death in the face of the pandemic and the criminal policies of the ruling class. The coming period will see an unprecedented entry of the global working class into struggle and the increasingly decisive role played by the WSWS and the ICFI in the direction and development of this spontaneous movement into a politically conscious struggle for socialism. The late 1980s and the decade of the 90s saw the final betrayal and transformation of all the nationally based labor organizations, from the Stalinists and Social Democrats to the AFL-CIO in the United States. The unprecedented globalization of capitalist production drove the final nail into all of these organizations based on the outmoded nation-state system. The ICFI insisted that the next stage of development of the class struggle would take the form of rebellion against the old labor bureaucracies, and increasingly, the working class would strive to coordinate its struggles across national boundaries. And the ICFI and the WSWS would give the most conscious expression to these objective strivings. Now, this theoretically guided conception has certainly been borne out, and for nearly 23 years, the WSWS has emerged as an invaluable weapon of the international working class, providing workers with a voice for its daily struggles, the organizational means to unite across borders, and the lessons of the history of the class struggle and the socialist movement necessary to arm it for the tasks that lie ahead. No other website or organization has had such an orientation to and such a deep relationship with the struggles of the working class. In the course of the last 2 decades, we have produced thousands of articles on the conditions and struggles of workers. And as Comrade Dave just said, some of our most widely read articles include the exposures of the deadly working conditions and calls to action. And we often get reports from workers in the factories all over the world informing us that the influence of the WSWS is in fact far greater than we even realize. It is no accident that in mid-March, just before the outbreak of the series of wildcat strikes in the auto factories in Metro Detroit and Toledo, more than 250,000 workers read our articles calling for the shutdown of the auto industry and reports on the actions of the Fiat Chrysler workers in Windsor. The WSWS and our digital newsletters have become a center of opposition for auto workers, teachers, healthcare workers, Amazon workers, transit workers, and others against the homicidal herd immunity policy of all the capitalist governments. During the pandemics, we have held online calls uniting transit workers in London, Berlin, and New York City, auto workers in the US, Canada, and Mexico, teachers and other educators from the US, Australia, Britain, Brazil, and Argentina, auto workers, educators, tea plantation workers in Sri Lanka have taken up our call for the formation of rank and file safety committees independent of the unions to counterpose the struggle by workers to protect their lives against the conspiracy of death by the corporations aided by the unions and backed by the corporate controlled parties. The factory exposures conducted by the Russian Social Democrats in the mid-1890s, Lenin said, evoked a, quote, veritable passion among workers to get into print, with the offices of the revolutionary movement literally flooded with correspondence from the factories and workplaces. But the fight for socialist consciousness, Lenin said, and the ICFI insists, requires an all-around political education of the working class on the international scope of its struggles and historical experiences, which demonstrate these experiences that the creation of a world without war, inequality, and oppression is only possible if the working class takes political and economic power in its own hands and transforms society. For the working class to conduct and unify its struggles, an implacable fight must be waged against the nationalist poison and militarism promoted by the unions and their pseudo-left supporters, which are used to divide workers along national, ethnic, linguistic, and racial lines. The WSWS has proudly fought to unite the international working class on the basis of an international socialist program, drawing to the attention of the most advanced workers and young people the most critical experiences over the last 2 decades and drawing out the strategic lessons of these experiences. Just to mention a few, this includes the upheavals in Indonesia and throughout Asia in 1998, the worldwide struggles against the US invasion of Iraq, the global financial crash, and the subsequent restructuring of class relations by all the capitalist governments, the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, the Wisconsin protests in 2011, the Maracana massacre in South Africa, and the frame-up of the Maruti Suzuki workers in 2012, the anti-austerity protests in Greece and Spain, betrayed by Syriza and Podemos, and the 2018-2019 global wave of strikes and protests, from the yellow vests in France to the teachers' strikes that began in West Virginia and other US states and spread internationally, to the revolt of the Mexican maquiladora workers in Matamoros, the 2019 General Motors strike, and the heroic stand of the GM workers in Silao, Michigan, who were victimized for refusing to work overtime during the US strike. This is continued with the mass protests in Chile, Puerto Rico, and Iraq, and most recently, the global protests against police killings in the US, Nigeria, and other countries. The WSWS did not just comment, certainly from the outside, but was an active participant in all of these struggles. It sought to provide the means forward, the fight for the independence of the working class, for its initiative in opposition to the trade union apparatuses, the building of rank and file safety and workplace committees, and it sought to draw out the critical strategic experiences of all of these struggles. And now in the new Relaunch WSWS, all of these struggles are far more accessible in the global class struggle section, which we are developing. Bitter experience has shown that the trade unions cannot be reformed, as the myriad of pseudo-left organizations claim. All such efforts have only resulted in tragedy for the working class and lucrative positions for the affluent layers of the upper middle class. Perhaps the clearest example of the anti-working class character of the unions was the 2012 massacre of 41 striking platinum miners in South Africa, overseen by the National Union of Mine Workers, whose leader, the Stalinist and billionaire Cyril Ramaphosa, now heads one of the most unequal countries in the world. But the transformation of the unions into direct instruments of the ruling class is a universal process, underscored by the revelations of the multi-million-dollar payoffs to the United Auto Workers Union, which is now seeking to force workers to continue to work under the pandemic, and in which workers rebelled against in March and once again in the late summer, organizing independent rank and file safety committees in their factories. This analysis has allowed the ICFI to understand the role the unions play and will play, and understand that it is only through the creation of new forms of working class struggle that the class struggle can develop unhindered from the sabotage of the pro-capitalist and nationalist trade unions. We are fighting all over the world for workers to build independent rank and file factory and workplace committees to defend themselves against unsafe conditions, against the historic demands for austerity. In the United States, we are fighting for the development of a political general strike against the efforts of Trump to carry out a coup, without at all adapting to the right-wing program and politics of Biden and the Democrats. In the coming months, we must develop the World Socialist website and its coverage, pay the closest attention to the conditions of workers and every form of opposition, which are covered up by the media and ignored by all the capitalist politicians. In all of this work, the basic aim is to develop a socialist leadership, and the WSWS and the ICFI will play an ever more direct role in the direction and development of the class struggle. At the turn of the last century, Lenin said the all-Russian Marxist newspaper, guided by an international socialist perspective, would be the scaffolding for the building of a revolutionary movement, a movement which would eventually take political power in October 1917. Today, the international working class has an enormous weapon, the World Socialist website, to coordinate the ever more complex and challenging tasks of the World Trotskyist movement, to unite and educate the most advanced workers and their struggles around the world, and to provide the necessary perspective and leadership for the final overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of world socialism.
Thank you, Comrade Jerry. We have 4 more speakers. The next speaker will be Comrade Genevieve Lee, who leads the work of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality in the United States. It is an extraordinary fact that many of our readers of the younger generation not only came into political activity after the founding of the WSWS, but in fact, in many cases were born after the founding of the World Socialist website. And this is a generation which has never known prosperity, which has, to whom the term the land of unlimited opportunity would have no meaning whatsoever. What have the youth of this generation known? Except war, the gig economy, the destruction of any hope for a reasonably prosperous future. It's a world of uncertainty, a world of ever-increasing violence. And many youth are now finding or have begun their political education through and with the World Socialist website. I'd like to invite Comrade Genevieve Lee to speak on the conditions of the youth and their role in the building of the revolutionary movement. Comrade Genevieve.
Thank you, David. First of all, I just want to say that I'm honored to be speaking today alongside so many leading comrades with decades of experience in our movement, many of whom were involved in the initial launch of the World Socialist website and from whom I've learned so much. For myself and a whole generation of comrades, as David noted, our entire political lives have been guided and shaped by this website. My generation, the millennial generation, has come into political life under conditions of unprecedented economic, social, and political crisis. We were the generation that graduated from high school just as the 2008 financial crash was taking place. And now, just over a decade later, we're living through a second worldwide catastrophe, the coronavirus pandemic. The youngest generation, Gen Z, is entering into political life under even sharper conditions. You could consider for a moment that those that are just coming into political life in the past year have been confronted with miles-long food lines in the US and around the world, a president that's talking about refusing to leave office, protesters being beaten by police in the streets just outside of the White House. Even before the current crisis, young workers were living under conditions created by 40 years of social counter-revolution that created staggering levels of inequality, mass unemployment, the lack of basic needs such as healthcare or retirement. It was upon these conditions that the pandemic acted, exacerbating all of the social ills created by the capitalist system. And now the brutality of the ruling class is on full display before the world as governments everywhere embrace the policy of herd immunity, which is the sacrificing of workers' lives to protect private profit. And all of these are experiences that are taking place, are mass experiences on a scale never before seen in modern history. Nearly every person on the planet is aware of the coronavirus and has been impacted in some way. Under these conditions, it's hardly surprising that a defining feature of the period is the immense radicalization of the working class, and in particular, young people. One statistic that I think begins to illustrate this year's survey is an annual survey conducted by YouGov, found an increase in support for socialism over the last year alone among youth that are part of Gen Z, so that's 16 to 23 years old, by nearly 10 percentage points. Over the course of a single year, support for socialism among these young people rose from 40% in 2019 to 49% in 2020. These are staggering figures. What the last year and really the years before the pandemic as well have shown is that young people do not lack anger. They do not lack a willingness to fight. They have a desire to change the world. We have seen this in the mass demonstrations against police violence and many other eruptions of social protest in which droves of young people were involved, not just in the United States, but all over the world. What is critically needed is a political perspective and program rooted in historical knowledge and an understanding of the experiences of the past. Young people are looking for answers to all of the pressing questions of today, and they're coming to find and will come to find that there's no greater resource than the World Socialist website. I know I speak for a whole layer of young people when I say that the WSWS is not only responsible for my political education, but in many ways also my formal education. It's where I learned about art and culture, about science, history, economics, and philosophy. It's where I first found a counter to the postmodernist and racialist poison that's promoted and pushed in the universities. Like countless youth in the party, when I was first introduced to the website, I spent months going through the archives, reading what the movement wrote about every major political event in my lifetime, the stolen election, the events of 9/11, the Iraq War and the protests against it, the emergence of WikiLeaks, the persecution of Julian Assange, 2008 financial crash, and many others. I think the real strength of the new site, as other comrades have mentioned, is just how comprehensively this wealth of knowledge, political perspective, and analysis is brought forward. It becomes so easily accessible. One can go back and read what the ICFI wrote the day after the September 11th attacks on 9/12. The level of political clarity with which the movement responded is really unparalleled. One can find comments like one article, Anti-Americanism, the Anti-Imperialism of Fools, which had a very profound effect on my political development. It takes a principled stand against all those demoralized middle-class elements who responded to the September 11th attacks with the vulgar anti-Americanism in the place of principled anti-imperialism. The WSWS explained at the time that it was the American ruling class and not the American population that was carrying out imperialist policies throughout the world. Another example is young people who have been profoundly impacted by the wave of school shootings and mass shootings can find in the archives of the WSWS comments like the Columbine High School Massacre, American Pastoral, American Berserk, which rooted the horrific events of April 1999 in the analysis of the nature of American society, the consequences of social inequality and endless war. If there are young people who are watching today who have not read these pieces and related pieces, I strongly encourage that you do so. These are just two examples, and this is an exercise that really can be repeated for every significant political and social event in recent history. However, perhaps more importantly, in the archives of the WSWS, young people will find the history of the working class. That is their own history, a history that is kept from workers, that's distorted and obscured to serve the interests of the ruling elite. They can learn about the Enlightenment, Marx, Engels, the advent and development of Marxism. They can learn about the Russian Revolution, the development of the left opposition, the immense class battles of the 1930s and 40s, including the extraordinary history of the American working class. They can, and really, we must learn about the history of the fight for socialism, which is contained within the history of our movement. For the ruling class, the WSWS poses an imminent threat, the greatest threat. They're desperate to cut young people off from knowledge of the history of working class struggle, of revolution, expressed most consciously in the history of the Marxist movement. It is because of this role that the World Socialist website is really unlike any website in the world. It's an organ of education and struggle for workers that will serve to arm workers and youth and a whole new generation of young people with the tools that they need, not just to understand the world, but to change it. I encourage young people and workers who are listening to this call, who are not already a part of the ICFI, to join today, to explore the new website, to help fund the new website, to understand it as your own, to contribute to it, to promote it, and to dedicate themselves to a study of history and to get involved in the fight for socialism today. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Genevieve. In the struggle of the Trotskyist movement, the fight against lies about history have played the most critical role. In the foreword to the Russian edition of Trotsky's volume entitled The Stalin School of Falsification, Trotsky wrote, "In point of fact, the lie in politics, as in daily life, serves as a function of the class structure of society. The oppressors erect the lie into a system of befuddling the masses in order to maintain their rule. On the part of the oppressed, the lie is a defensive weapon of weakness. Revolution explodes the social lie. Revolution speaks the truth. Revolution begins by giving things and social relationships their real name." Now, of course, in the struggle against Stalinism, the fight against the lie was the fight, for the most part, against the falsifications of the history of the Russian Revolution by the Stalinist regime. In the more recent period, in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the International Committee had to pay a great deal of attention in refuting new lies against Trotsky himself that were presented not only by old Stalinists, but also by such writers as Thatcher and service, who wrote entire biographies in which they borrowed heavily from the opus of Stalinism to discredit Trotsky. But in the more recent period, in addition to the defense of the history of the socialist movement, the World Socialist website has been called upon to defend the legacy of the revolutions that occurred on American soil, the great revolutions that founded the United States and then which eliminated slavery. The bourgeoisie cannot tell the truth about revolution in any part of the world, even when it relates to the history of their own country. They break with the past, they repudiate their own revolutionary traditions, and we live in an age where even such immense figures in the founding of the United States, truly world historical figures such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, are subjected to abuse and denunciation. And even the man who is without question the greatest figure in American political history, Abraham Lincoln, its greatest president, and perhaps its greatest writer, now we must witness the tearing down of his statues. During the past year, as the readers of the World Socialist website know, we have paid a tremendous amount of attention to refuting the lies against American history associated with the so-called 1619 Project. The process of refutation has extended beyond more than a year, and the work of the WSWS has acquired a broad international following. The first reply to the 1619 Project appeared in the pages of the WSWS in September 2019, only a few weeks after the initial publication of the 1619 Project in the pages of the New York Times. And our next speaker, Niall Nemeth, the assistant editor of the US edition of the World Socialist website, was a co-author of that initial statement. So I'd like to ask Comrade Nemeth to discuss the significance of the refutation of the 1619 Project and the attitude of the World Socialist website to questions of history. Comrade Niles.
Thank you, David. As others have noted in this meeting, the defense of historical truth is central to the work of the World Socialist website. Our political practice is always based on an assimilation of the lessons of the past. The most powerful weapon the working class has is the knowledge of the historical experiences through which it has passed, in order to know what it has won, what it must defend today, and how it must fight to achieve socialism in the future. From the defense of the Russian Revolution and Leon Trotsky against the Stalinist and post-Stalinist schools of historical falsifications, to the fight against the trivialization of Nazi crimes in Germany, the Trotskyist movement has been, from its founding, at the forefront of the fight for historical truth. The great historian of the left opposition, Vadim Rogovin, explained that, like ideological ones, historical myths are a product of immediate class interests. Refuting these myths is only possible by rehabilitating historical truth, the honest portrayal of actual facts and tendencies of the past. Over the past year, the fight to defend historical truth took a new form. The defense of the revolutionary traditions of the great democratic revolutions in the United States, the American Revolution, and the Civil War. It came as a surprise to many when the WSWS emerged at the forefront in opposing the New York Times 1619 Project, a rewriting, indeed falsification, of American history, presenting the history of the United States as a history of racial conflict. In fact, we are the only publication that has raised any criticism of the project from the left. This confusion was based on the fact that the genuine principles of Marxism and socialism have been so distorted and misrepresented by the middle-class pseudo-left, which is in fact an anti-left. Our first in-depth exposure of the project was published on September 3rd, 2019, just 2 weeks after the project was published with much fanfare in a special edition of the New York Times Magazine. From the start, we recognized that the most profound theoretical and political issues were at stake. The rewriting of history is always related to the political interests of the present. As we noted in our original exposure, the aim of the New York Times is to create a historical narrative that legitimizes the effort of the Democratic Party to construct an electoral coalition based on the prioritizing of personal identities. That is, gender, sexual preference, ethnicity, and above all, race. Above all, the 1619 Project erases the struggles of the working class from American history. We defend all that is progressive in history. We understand history is not a morality tale, but is the evolution of mankind through the development of the class struggle. We understand that the working class cannot conquer new heights if it does not defend what has been won in the past. And we are irreconcilably opposed to all efforts to divide workers along racial, national, or gender lines. Marxism long ago settled its account of with the limitations of bourgeois democracy, but it never gave up the fight for equality. The progressive concept inscribed on the banners of the bourgeois revolutionaries of the 18th and 19th century, that all men are created equal, finds its most advanced expression today in the Marxist movement. The United States is the center of world imperialism. Its working class has been forged from innumerable nationalities and ethnicities from every corner of the globe. The challenge of uniting the working class in the United States is essential to the victory of socialism worldwide. We are proud to have provided a mass audience for the best scholars of American history, including Gordon Wood, James McPherson, James Oakes, Victoria Bynum, Claiborne Carson, Richard Carwadine, Adolph Reed Jr., and Dolores Janusky, to voice their criticisms of the 1619 Project. They have all devoted their life's work to the defense of historical truth and the principles of democratically motivated scholarship. Due to the work done by the World Socialist website, the 1619 Project has been thoroughly exposed. The material that we have published, all of which can be easily accessed thanks to the relaunch of the World Socialist website, has been viewed hundreds of thousands of times by readers worldwide. Above all, this powerful response makes clear that workers in this country and around the world are deeply attached to the revolutionary history of the United States, embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the struggle to smash slavery led by Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, as well as the monumental struggles out of which the working class emerged. The relaunch of the World Socialist website is rooted in an understanding of the relationship of the past to the present. Indeed, in its very form, it is aimed at drawing these connections. The WSWS is itself an immense repository of historical truth. What the WSWS has achieved over the last 2 decades must be brought forward and expanded to arm the international working class for the monumental struggles to come.
Thank you, Comrade Niles. It is not only history that the World Socialist website and the International Committee is called upon to defend in a period of capitalist reaction. We also must defend the heritage of science and its claims on the future of humanity. The development of the pandemic has exposed in such a glaring way how the descent into irrationalism, anti-science, mysticism is the most characteristic feature of the present day degeneration of bourgeois intellectual, social, and cultural life. Comrade Bryan, also a representative of the younger generation of WSWS writers, has written extensively on the pandemic. I just would like to point out, I hope he will emphasize this point, that the initial warning of the danger of the pandemic, not just for the United States, but for the world, was published in the World Socialist website on January 24th of this year. And since then, there has been a continuous stream of articles day after day recording the tragic progression of the pandemic and the failure of the ruling elites to attempt any action to block its spread. Malign neglect has now become a policy of the deliberate encouragement of mass infection. So I would like to ask Comrade Bryan to address the rally and discuss the implications of the pandemic and the coverage of this phenomenon by the WSWS. Comrade Bryan.
Thank you, Comrade North, for inviting me to speak today at today's extraordinary rally. Comrades and friends, I'd like to use this opportunity to speak on the approach of the World Socialist website to science. For the past 9 months, this has been most embodied by our coverage of the coronavirus pandemic. Starting with the first articles published in January, we have undertaken a very careful analysis of the medical significance of this new virus and its intersection with society. This has involved both articles on the political situation, as well as material on the epidemiology of the virus itself. In contrast, the Trump administration, the Democrats, and their counterparts internationally essentially ignored the science and all sought to downplay and conceal the threat posed by the contagion. As such, we were the only political tendency to warn very early on the dangers the working class faced if the virus was allowed to run rampant across the world, and to call for a globally coordinated emergency response to the spreading coronavirus pandemic. Those warnings have been tragically confirmed. More than 1.15 million human beings are dead worldwide, and social life for billions has been totally upended. Such figures expose the stark contradictions in modern society between the immense advances that have been made in medicine during the last century and the barriers placed on applying these advances to everyday life under capitalism. In a rational and scientifically planned world, an emergent and potentially pandemic-inducing disease would not be neglected for weeks and months to protect the stock market, but met immediately with every resource available to contain the pathogen, treat those infected, and secure the livelihoods of the hundreds of millions of people who will be affected by the economic fallout. The gap between what science says would be good for humanity and what is happening under capitalism exists in every field of science, medicine, as well as physics, biology, astronomy, to name a few. As we noted in our recent coverage of the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft's sample collection of an asteroid, quote, "It is almost incalculable what results would be delivered within our lifetime," end quote, if the resources for war and profits were turned to exploration and scientific discovery. More broadly, our focus on science since the founding of the website in 1998 stems from our insistence that the working class, if it is to advance, must be armed with a thorough understanding of the world. This is a point Marxists have always stressed. The development of society as a whole is based on the development of the productive forces, which in turn drive and are spurred on by developments in science. The technology through which we are having this meeting, the internet, became so pervasive in large part because of the emergence of transnational production in the early 1990s, which provided an economic necessity for the ability to store and access information from anywhere in the world instantaneously. This is not, however, simply a matter of, for example, an auto worker knowing the mechanics, electrical engineering, material science, and thermodynamics that make a car possible. There is a need to turn toward a scientific approach, not just to natural phenomena, but to understanding the just as complex historical and social processes that govern our lives, the objective laws of capitalist development. Such studies are all the more necessary in a world dominated by the incessant glorification of irrationalism, whether through the cultivation of backwardness and religious obscurantism, or the promotion of postmodernism. Workers must take up the fight against all those who deny that objective truth and objective knowledge exists, that somehow reality is created through language. If that were true, Trump's assertion over the summer that with smaller testing we would show fewer cases would have meant an end to the pandemic. Workers must also be at the forefront in the struggle against all attempts to divide it using anti-scientific concepts such as race. As we've written about on the WSWS extensively, there's no basis for the concept of different races of human beings. Whether in the anthropologic record, which shows a great deal of human migration and mixing even hundreds of thousands of years ago, to DNA itself, which in fact cannot be used to reveal someone's race or nationality. The WSWS has also paid special attention to the ever-growing existential threat of climate change, Similar to the pandemic, it knows no national borders and is an inherently international problem. As many recent scientific papers on the topic have stressed, the only real solution to halting global warming and all its ongoing and oncoming catastrophes is the reorganization of the world's energy production and transportation infrastructure and the development of new technologies to immediately halt carbon emissions. We have also insisted that the fight for a safe environment must reject any solution to the climate crisis that calls for a vast reduction of the world's, quote, surplus population. Such Malthusian attitudes deny the fact that it is not humanity that has brought the world's biosphere to the brink of collapse. It is the twin barriers of capitalism and the nation-state system that have stunted any serious efforts to reverse global warming. Driven inexorably by its internal contradictions, capitalism is leading mankind toward the abyss of plagues, world war, environmental catastrophe, and dictatorship. These same contradictions, however, also produce the basis for the overthrow of capitalism, the international working class. As Trotsky noted 94 years ago in his speech now known as Radio, Science, Technique, and Society, technique and science have their own logic, the logic of the cognition of nature and the mastering of it in the interests of man. But technique and science develop not in a vacuum, but in human society, which consists of classes. The ruling class, the possessing class, controls technique and through it controls nature. Our writing on science, now more accessible than ever on the relaunched WSWS, fights to make these objective processes more conscious, to imbue the growing opposition of millions of workers and youth with the knowledge and understanding that the progress of science and the progress of humanity as a whole depends on the resurgence of a new revolutionary movement of the working class. Our movement unites under its banner both the pursuit of scientific truth in all its forms and the struggle to establish an internationally coordinated, scientifically directed system of economic planning based on equality and the satisfaction of human need, socialism.
Thank you very much, Comrade Brian. Now, before we come to our final speaker, Comrade Joseph Kishore, who is both the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party and our presidential candidate, I would like to call the attention of all those who are participating in this rally to Mehring.com, the site of our party publication website. If you go to Mehring.com, you will find a list of all the major publications put out by the World Socialist website, books, pamphlets, and also valuable reading from other prominent writers whose contributions to historical studies are especially valued by the International Committee and the Socialist Equality Party. Mehring.com is an immense resource. We are devoting and will be devoting ever greater efforts to develop its prominence as a source of a revolutionary Marxist literature. And again, we'd like to urge you, if you have not already made a contribution, to go to wsws.org and donate, wsws.org/donate, to make a contribution to the WSWS. As I've said, our final speaker is Comrade Joseph Kishore, the National Secretary of the SEP. The Socialist Equality Party has intervened in this election. It is conducting primarily a write-in campaign. I must report, and you'll know this if you've been following the WSWS carefully, there has been a determined effort, once again, to bar our candidates from a place on the ballot. The American electoral system is among the most undemocratic in the world. But nevertheless, the political message of the WSWS is breaking through to an ever wider audience. And so Comrade Joe will speak today on the significance of the 2020 elections, which is not just an American, but clearly a world event. And it will review again the perspective of the International Committee and the SEP. Comrade Joe.
Thank you, David. And I'm very pleased to be able to speak to this rally welcoming the relaunch of the World Socialist website. the political organ of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution. I think the speeches today from throughout the world give expression to conceptions at the center of the World Socialist website, the fight to unify the working class internationally. We have had speakers from 10 countries advancing a unified perspective rooted in the character of the epoch and the crisis of world capitalism. The speeches, I think, have provided a partial outline of the immense record of the World Socialist website and of its extraordinary power. We have outlined a fight that bases the development of a socialist movement on the lessons of history, the unrelenting opposition of the Trotskyist movement to war, the destruction of democratic rights, the rooting of working class politics in an opposition to the politics of the upper middle class. As other speakers have explained, the coronavirus pandemic is enormously accelerating the contradictions of world capitalism. It is exposing the reality of class rule, the consequences of the subordination of social, economic, and political life to the interests of an oligarchy. It is radicalizing masses of workers and youth throughout the world and creating conditions for revolutionary upheavals. Nowhere is this more clear than in the United States, the center of world finance and the cockpit of imperialism. We are just over 1 week until the end of voting in the US elections. And it's clear that whatever happens on November 3rd and after, this is an election from which there is no going back. There's no return to the status quo. It is an undeniable fact that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is utilizing the election to develop a fascistic movement based upon extreme nationalism, anti-socialism, and authoritarianism. He's not running for president, he's running for Führer. In his effort to stay in power regardless of the vote, Trump is counting on a base of support within sections of the financial oligarchy, far-right organizations, and a fascistic network operating within the police, military, and state apparatus. In recent weeks, fascistic plots have been exposed targeting the governors of Michigan, Virginia, and most recently, Ohio. The Democrats and the media act as if everything will return to normal if only Trump is removed. Trump, however, is not some sort of demon from hell. He is the product of American capitalism. To understand what is happening in the United States today, it is necessary to study the archives of the World Socialist website. In its 22 years of continuous publication, the WSWS has exhaustively documented the evolution of the crisis of American democracy. This crisis, the WSWS has explained, is rooted in the long-term decline of American capitalism and the efforts of the ruling class to offset that decline through bloody imperialist violence abroad and social counter-revolution at home. It is now 2 decades since the theft of the 2000 elections. The World Socialist website explained, as the theft was being carried out, that the decision by the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore in 2000 and the refusal of the Democratic Party to do anything to stop what was in fact an anti-democratic coup to install Bush in power demonstrated that there did not exist a significant constituency for democratic rights in the American ruling class. It is 19 years since the initiation of the war on terror under Bush. The September 11th attacks were used as a pretext to wage war first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. The war of aggression against Iraq, launched on the basis of outright lies, was, the World Socialist website wrote in March 2003, quote, a devastating failure of American democracy. The war was accompanied by the adoption of torture as official policy, the construction of CIA black sites throughout the world, and domestic spying on a scale unprecedented in history. The World Socialist website analyzed the role of Obama, the so-called candidate of hope and change, in overseeing what was, up to that point, the largest transfer of wealth from the working class to the rich in world history in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. 8 years of unending war, social reaction, and attacks on democratic rights under Obama created the conditions for the election of Trump. The victory of Trump, the WSWS explained in November of 2016, quote, is a political earthquake that has exposed before the entire world the terminal crisis of American democracy. Such is the degeneration of bourgeois rule that it has elevated an obscene charlatan and billionaire demagogue to the highest office in the land. 4 years later, American democracy is at death's door. The pandemic is revealing all that is rotten, diseased, and reactionary in American society. At every stage of this pandemic, the interests of public health and lives have been subordinated to the interests of profit. The ruling class downplayed the threat posed by the coronavirus. Then it utilized it to engineer a bailout of Wall Street even greater than in 2008. As a result of the trillions of dollars funneled into the markets, with the bipartisan support of both Democrats and Republicans, bank profits have soared, along with the wealth of the oligarchs. On the other hand, the vast majority of the population faces an unprecedented social and economic crisis. There are 10 million fewer jobs, 10 million fewer people employed today than in January of this year. The number of people in the US living in poverty has risen by 6 million people from June to September of this year alone, and mass layoffs are accelerating as the ruling class utilizes the conditions created by the pandemic to restructure class relations. The ruling elites, having given trillions of dollars to themselves, are opposed to any efforts to contain the virus. Quote, we're not going to control the pandemic, Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, declared this weekend, by which he really means that the ruling class will do nothing to protect the people and indeed will actively work to ensure that people are infected. The massive sums handed to the banks must be paid for through the sweat, blood, and lives of the population. Far-right organizations are being mobilized in order to implement and enforce a homicidal policy. The slogan raised by the fascists is "No constraints on the spread of the coronavirus." How corrupt and degraded is American politics? On the one hand, you have a president who is making an open appeal to fascists. On the other hand are the Democrats who do everything they can to cover up what is happening, to chloroform public opinion, to keep all opposition within the framework of the state. The Democrats, speaking for sections of Wall Street and the military, go on about Russian interference in the US elections, as if the threat to American democracy came from without and not from the financial oligarchy within. A Biden administration, if it comes to power, would be committed immediately to an expansion of war in the Middle East and a more aggressive policy against Russia. It would, in fact, only strengthen the power of the military and intelligence agencies over political life while creating the best conditions for the further growth of fascistic movements. It is an extraordinary fact in this context that amidst the most open assault on democracy and the incitement of fascistic violence by Trump, the Democrats have spent most of the past year attacking and repudiating the democratic heritage of the American Revolution and Civil War. As for Bernie Sanders, what has become of his so-called political revolution? Sanders has cast aside his insincere rhetoric about opposing the billionaire class and is now the chief booster of Biden, the scion of Wall Street. Sanders is even claiming that this arch-reactionary will be the most progressive president since FDR. And meanwhile, everything is done to exclude any genuine opposition. As David said, the courts this year have upheld, under conditions of a pandemic, the requirement that the Socialist Equality Party, in order to get on the ballot, has to gather thousands, tens of thousands of signatures from individuals in order just to get on the ballot, creating the best conditions for endangering the health not only of ourselves, but the public at large. And the courts backed by both the Democrats and Republicans, have argued that just to get on the ballot, such actions are necessary, exposing how corrupt is the so-called democratic process in the United States. The working class in the United States and throughout the world must follow not the electoral map, but the logic of the class struggle. Workers must intervene on the basis of a program that meets their needs, including a massive reallocation of wealth from the rich, the seizure of all the ill-gotten gains of the billionaires, and the transformation of the gigantic banks and corporations into public utilities, run on the basis of social need and not private profit. The fight against fascism, dictatorship, world war, environmental degradation, and unprecedented levels of social inequality must be connected to the conquest of power by the working class itself and the establishment of socialism in the United States and around the world. That is the perspective that the Socialist Equality Party, my running mate Nerissa Santa Cruz, and I are advancing in our election campaign. To forge a path to the future, the working class requires a detailed knowledge of its own history, the history of the struggle for socialism, embodied in the Fourth International and the Trotskyist movement. Workers must be able to establish connections to and learn from the experiences of workers throughout the world. Workers and youth need to be trained to oppose all those forces, from Sanders to Corbyn to Syriza and Podemos, or the Pink Tide in Latin America, all those forces who seek to subordinate their struggles to capitalism. They must be trained to analyze politics in class terms, to generalize from their own experiences to an understanding of the social system as a whole. They must have access to the analysis, cultural commentary, scientific knowledge, and theoretical writings that will prepare them for the immense tasks ahead. The essential framework and scaffolding of this movement is the World Socialist website. In its 22 years of publication, the World Socialist website has established an enormous political foundation. The relaunching of the World Socialist website provides the framework for bringing this foundation more directly into the present. The future development of the WSWS and its transformation into what it must become, the leadership of millions and millions of people in a global struggle for socialism, is the task that lies before us. And I would urge all of those listening today to make the decision to become active in the fight for socialism and this struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Joe. Comrade Joe is the last speaker. And I think it can be said that this rally has very clearly demonstrated the source of the enormous political strength of the World Socialist website. Its theoretical political foundations, the very advanced level of its political cadre. We are building a global movement. The World Socialist website is presently published in 23 languages. In addition to English, it appears in German, in French, in Spanish, in Portuguese, Norwegian, Russian, Sinhalese, Tamil, Arabic, Chinese, Greek, Italian, Romanian, Urdu, Farsi, Serbo-Croatian, Afrikaans, Bengali, Hindi, Dutch, Czech, and Telugu. Our aim is nothing less than the international unification of the working class on the basis of a program of World Socialist Revolution. No other movement can carry out this task except that which is based on the principles of Marxism, fought for and represented most brilliantly in the 20th century by Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was assassinated 80 years ago on August 20th, 1940. Yet 80 years later, his political program, as it has been developed over the many decades by the International Committee of the Fourth International is the only one which speaks to the problems of our time and shows the way forward. So I'd like to end this meeting by urging all of you who are following this rally, and I know that there is a substantial audience all over the world, to make the decision not only to read and support, but become active as members of the International Committee of the Fourth International. If there is not a section in the country which you live, initiate the important work of establishing such a section, of taking up the fight for revolutionary principles. You will find in the World Socialist website an extraordinary source of political strength upon which such work can be carried forward. So we will now conclude the rally. And finally, under conditions of this continuing pandemic, we would like to urge all our readers and followers and participants in this rally to take care of themselves, observe the proper health requirements. But remember that in the final analysis, the solution to this pandemic will not be found through mere personal actions or even through the development of scientific initiatives, but above all, through the political action of the international working class fighting for socialism. Thank you very much. Good night.